Committee will come to order. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. The first part of our meeting is to organize the committee. That's why we don't have Dr. Elmendorf at his usual chair at this moment. We're here to adopt the committee rules and the oversight plan. Before introducing our new members, I want to note my desire to keep this committee going as it has, which is a long-standing tradition that's bipartisan of comedy, of a collegial atmosphere. Previous chairmen like John Spratt, Jim Nussel, kept this committee moving in a very collegial way. We have strong differences of opinion on how to achieve these goals, but we've always managed in this committee to do it with mutual respect of one another. Mr. Van Hollen shares that goal. I think we've exercised this in the last session, and it is my goal and desire to continue that tradition going forward. We also have a lot of new members of the committee here today, and I want to introduce our new Republican members before I turn it over to Mr. Van Hollen. We have from Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn. Is Marsha here? Yeah, there she is. We have Vicki Hartzler from Missouri. We have Ellen Nunnally from Mississippi. We have Jim Renacci from Ohio. We have Scott Ridgel from Virginia. We have Luke Messer from Indiana. We have this rule, apparently. We have to have at least 3 Hoosiers on the committee. We're satisfying that rule, but we also got 3 Wisconsinites this year, so that's a pretty cool thing. We have Tom Rice from South Carolina. We have Jackie Walorski from Indiana and Roger Williams from Texas. Right now, I'd like to yield to Mr. Van Hollen to introduce their new members of the committee.
Let me start, Mr. Chairman, by thanking you for the way you've conducted business in the Budget Committee, both the last session, and look forward to working with you in the same manner in this session. As you indicated, we have very sharp differences on policy issues, but in this committee we've always been able to have that exchange of views in a civil way, and I think that helps the debate going forward. So thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. We have welcome to new members on the Republican side. We're really pleased to have some new members as well on our side. Not all of them are new to the Congress. Some of them are, and some of them aren't. We have Mr. McDermott, Jim McDermott from Washington State, also serving on the Ways and Means Committee. Barbara Lee, of course, from California. It's great to have you on board. David Cicilline from the state of Rhode Island, and we're really pleased that he's here. Kurt Schrader is with us from the state of Oregon, and thank you for your interest in serving on this committee as well. Now we also have some new members who have joined us. Hakeem Jeffries is with us. He's from the state of New York. Mark Pocan from Wisconsin. Michelle Lujan Grisham from New Mexico. Jared Huffman from California. And Tony Cardenas from California. I don't know if he's been able to join us yet. So welcome to our returning members and new members on both sides of the aisle.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hollen, and thank you, everybody, for joining the committee. Look forward to a very good and thorough debate. Today, we meet to consider the committee's rules of procedure and to consider the committee's oversight plan. The proposed rules and oversight plan have been shared with all members of the committee. My understanding is that the minority has no objections to the rules and oversight plan. The committee's rules set out its procedures and conform them to the House rules effectively. The committee's oversight plan outlines its proposal for planned activities for this Congress. We will now proceed to consider the committee rules for adoption. These rules are essentially the same rules that the committee has operated in under the past, under both Democratic and Republican majorities. The changes are largely technical to conform to our committee rules with changes to House rules that were made at the beginning of the Congress. If there are any questions, I can ask the staff to briefly review them, review the changes of the rules if there are any. At this time, I'd like to recognize the member from California, Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that, consistent with Clause 4 of House Rule 16, the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time.
Without objection, the request is agreed to. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the rules package. Without objection, the markup document is considered read and is open for amendment at any point. My understanding is that we will have no amendments, so I'd like to move to the adoption of the rules. I now recognize the member of California, Mr. Campbell, for the purpose of offering the necessary motions to adopt the rules package.
Mr. Chairman.
Wait. Oh. Mr. McDermott, you have a question? You got to hold it down for more than a second.
Oh, there it goes.
You were here before. Come on.
Yeah, well, but I just want to clarify the selection of witnesses. How is that done? Which section is that in the rules?
Mr. Astucia, can you answer the question, Chief Counsel?
It does not show up in the committee rules, it's in the House rules. In general, it's been done by practice. We normally, we do it through a collegial discussion between the majority and the minority, so that the minority is always assured a proportional number of witnesses, which is consistent with the House rules.
And that means
So that if, for instance, if there's a
you
panel
could have
of,
5 witnesses. How many Democrat and how many Republican would there be out?
in that example, it would generally be 3 and 2.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the chairman, the member from California, Mr. Campbell, for the purpose of offering the necessary motions now to adopt the rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee adopt the chairman's mark as the rules of procedure of the Committee on Budget for the 113th Congress.
The question is on the motion offered by the member of California. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the rules package is adopted. The committee will now consider the oversight plan for the 113th Congress. Under both the House and committee rules, the Budget Committee is required to adopt an oversight plan by February 15th. The plan before the committee summarizes the areas in which we will consider oversight and conduct oversight. These items include the budget resolution, budget process reform, budget enforcement, and the economy. The plan lays out an initial schedule for hearings and other meetings, very similar to what this committee traditionally does. I would emphasize that this schedule is not binding and therefore does not preclude the committee from holding hearings on other topics as need arises or circumstances change. This plan has been shared with all members of the committee, and my understanding is that there will be no amendments. Without objection, the oversight plan is considered as read. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Campbell, for the purpose of offering the necessary motion to adopt the oversight plan.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee adopt the chairman's mark as the oversight plan for the Committee on Budget for the 113th Congress.
The question is on the motion offered by the member from California. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes do have it, and the oversight plan is adopted. I ask unanimous consent that the committee be authorized to issue and print copies of the compilation of laws and rules regarding the congressional budget process. Without objection, so ordered. I now ask unanimous consent that Representatives Price, Black, and Blumenauer be recognized as members of the Committee on the Budget for the purpose of the hearing on CBO Budget and Economic Outlook and be allowed to be recognized as such. Without objection, so ordered. The reason for this is Ways and Means has not yet designated its committee members, and these are to be our Ways and Means designees to the committee. But since the Ways and Means Committee has not set its committee members yet, that's why this move is necessary. I expect the Ways and Means, by the end of the week, will have designated all of its members. It's because of a vacancy occurred on the Republican side of the aisle that this is happening. By the end of the week, they will be official, full, free, clear members of the Budget Committee in good standing. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical, conforming, or stylistic changes to the committee rules and oversight plan, and that the rules of the Committee on the Budget be issued as a committee print, and that the chairman submit the rules for printing in the Congressional Record within 30 days, and that the chairman be authorized to submit the oversight plan to the Committees on House Administration and Oversight and Government Reform.
Without objection, so ordered. That concludes the items of the business on the agenda for the House Budget Committee's organizational meeting. We will now proceed immediately to the CBO Budget and Economic Outlook hearing. If Dr. Elmendorf could take his usual and customary position. Kind of feels like Groundhog Day sometimes, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, let me start this hearing first off by welcoming our new members. We've got a lot of new members who cover a big cross-section of this country who represent different areas, different views, different philosophies. And I just want to first start off by saying how much of a pleasure it is to serve on this committee. This is the kind of committee where you get to bring your ideas to the table and air them out. We've got enormous fiscal challenges ahead of us. We've got a debt problem that we all acknowledge must be dealt with. We've got a deficit that needs to be brought down. We've got an economy that needs growth. And this is one of those areas, one of those committees where we need to have this debate. We're going to be processing legislation. We're going to be considering alternatives. And I just want to say, on behalf of those of us here on this side of the aisle, we look forward to engaging in our friends on the other side of the aisle in the collegial and comedy way we have. And it will be a good, vigorous debate. And this is what the country deserves. With that, welcome to everybody to today's hearing. Thanks again, Dr. Elmendorf, Doug, for coming and testifying. And I want to thank you for your staff for putting together the latest budget and economic outlook. We understand you had a bit of a time crunch given the end of the year episodes that occurred. And I want to just say that you didn't miss much of a deadline, and you put out your baseline and outlook in a fairly quick form given the circumstances that you had to contend with. I'm sorry to say, though, that things don't look good. The CBO says that our economy will grow by only 1.4% this year. Unemployment will hover around 8% this year. And we will add another $1 trillion to our debt. That's what the news we just received from the CBO. Farther down the road, things get worse. The CBO says we will add $10 trillion to our total debt by the end of the budget window. That debt will weigh down our economy like an anchor. Starting in 2019, the economy will grow by a mere 2.2%, much, much lower than the historical average. And when people can't find jobs, many stop looking altogether for work. In other words, this report is a warning of what's to come if we don't get spending under control. Publicly held debt will hit 76% of GDP at the end of this year. That's the largest share of debt since 1951. In the 1950s, we paid down our debt, and our economy kicked into high gear. These days, we still haven't gotten a handle on spending. Total debt already exceeds 100% of gross domestic product. You see, we're in the danger zone. Economists from the right and the left say that if you get your total debt at that area, you really go into the danger zone. Investors might begin to doubt our ability to pay our obligations. They might demand higher interest rates. As we know in this committee, if they did that, interest rates across the country would skyrocket. On mortgages, on credit cards, on car loans. One estimate says that an interest rate increase of a single percentage point will cost the average family $400 more each and every year. In short, we could have a debt crisis. And the result of a debt crisis would be catastrophic. Because unlike during the financial crisis, government would be unable to borrow more money. Instead, the only way out would be austerity, which we're witnessing in Europe. Big tax hikes and big spending cuts. Interest goes up, we literally start losing control of our own fiscal situation. We become slaves to interest on the debt. We don't have to look far for examples of a debt crisis in action. We don't even have to look at Europe. In Central Falls, Rhode Island, retirees' pensions have been slashed by up to 55%. In Stockton, California, a quarter of the police force has been laid off. If a debt crisis hit this country, the social safety net would unravel. The most vulnerable would suffer, and we cannot let that happen. This is our obligation here in this committee. And if this report shows us anything, it is that primarily spending is the problem. Spending on Medicare and Social Security is set to double. Spending on interest is set to quadruple. The CBO expects revenue to double in the next 10 years. So taxes are going up. Revenue is rising. It's doubling. But even with the president's tax hikes, the budget never, ever, ever balances. In fact, it doesn't even come close. By 2023, the deficit will be nearly $1 trillion, just like it is today. The president says we need a balanced approach to closing the deficit, by which he seems to mean one tax hike after another. But the fact is, mathematically, we can't tax our way out of this problem. We need to get serious on spending. And unfortunately, the president has yet to produce a budget. It was due last week. In violation of the law, it has yet to be received by Congress. And Senate Democrats haven't passed a budget in nearly 4 years. Hopefully that will change. We will offer our budget here in the House on time next month in accordance to the law. We will put our plan up against the president's, and we will have a healthy debate in the House over the way forward. With that, I'd like to yield to the ranking member for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join the chairman in welcoming Dr. Elmendorf, and thank you and your team at the Congressional Budget Office for the professional work that you do. Just at the outset, let me say with respect to the timing of the President's budget submission, I think all of us who were part of the last Congress know that we struggled until January 2nd to pass legislation to avoid the fiscal cliff. The result of that legislation was to make sure that we did not see a sharp increase in taxes on middle-income Americans, but we asked higher-income individuals to begin to contribute to reducing the debt over the long term. As CBO has said, that action did help strengthen the economy. If we'd actually gone over the fiscal cliff, we'd be in a world of hurt. But it did take us until January 2nd to do it, and we didn't know how much revenue would be coming in either this year or in the next 10 years. So it's understandable that the President needs a little more time on the budget. Look, as the Budget Committee, our challenge is to try and come up with a blueprint for our country's decisions on spending and taxes. And while we talk a lot about numbers, ultimately it should be a reflection of where the American people are in terms of their values and their priorities. And I believe, and I hope we share this view, that as we approach the budget, our number one priority has to be expanding economic growth, making sure we promote job creation, making sure we strengthen the middle class so that we don't have an economy that just works for some folks at the very top, but we have an economy that works for everybody in terms of rising wages and rising incomes, and a plan that meets the commitments we made to people throughout the country, including our seniors. That's the overriding goal. And reducing deficits, especially over the long term, has to be an important part of that, but it has to be seen in the context of the overriding goal: job creation, strengthening the middle class. And so I hope as we have these discussions over how we reduce our deficits, what's the timing and pace and target of doing that, we look at it through the lens of job creation, strengthening the middle class. And that should hold true whether we're talking about the short term, the medium term, or the long term. Over the long term, there's no doubt, we see rising deficits. And the challenge, as we've said before, is not whether we reduce those deficits, but again, the magnitude of the reduction, the timing of the reduction, and how we do it. And as the President said last night, we support taking a balanced approach to that, meaning cuts. And I would just remind my colleagues that over the last 2 years, including the Budget Control Act and previous actions, we will reduce spending by $1.5 trillion by capping discretionary spending. As a result of the agreement to avoid the fiscal cliff, we will raise $600 billion in revenue from higher income earners. If you add up the interest savings on that, that's $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction. Yes, we have to do more in the out years, but we believe that in order to do it the right way and meet our commitments to our citizens and preserve economic growth and strengthen the middle class, we've got to make sure we deal with that in a balanced way. Now, let me just say, in the short term, that means dealing with the sequester, Mr. Chairman. You cited the fact that CBO projects 1.4% growth. None of us want to see growth that slow. A full 0.6% of that growth is attributed, of that lack of growth, is attributed to the sequester. In other words, if we were to replace the sequester in a balanced way, you would add 0.6% to growth, and translating that number into actual jobs, and we'll get testimony from Dr. Elmendorf, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs lost this year if we don't replace the sequester. Now, we on the Democratic side have in this Congress proposed a plan to replace the sequester, that $85 billion in meat axe cuts, with a mix of cuts, which is in your budget as well, dealing with ag subsidies, getting rid of the direct payments, but also saying that we shouldn't be providing tax breaks to big oil companies, and we believe that we should apply the Buffett rule to people making over $2 million a year. We heard a lot of talk during the last election from both candidates and all candidates about all the tax breaks in the tax code. Well, we should get rid of some of those, and we should get rid of some of those for the purpose of deficit reduction in a balanced way. And that's what our sequester replacement plan does in the short term, and frankly, that's what it would do in the long term. So we hope we can have an opportunity to have an up or down vote, Mr. Chairman, on the plan that we've put forward. We've put it forward for a vote at least 2 or 3 times now. We're going to be in the Rules Committee later today asking for a vote on that proposal that will save hundreds of thousands of jobs and prevent this disruption. And I hope we can have an opportunity, as you say, just to have a free flow of debate and ultimately a vote and let the chips fall where they may. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd love to begin the debate right now, but we probably have a hearing to get into. So, Dr. Elmendorf, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Van Hollen. To all the members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to discuss with you CBO's outlook for the budget and the economy over the next 10 years. Our analysis shows that the country continues to face very large economic and budget challenges. Let me discuss the economy first, and then I'll turn to the budget. We anticipate that economic growth will remain slow this year because the gradual improvement we see in underlying economic factors will be offset by a tightening of federal fiscal policy scheduled under current law. The good news is that the effects of the financial and housing crisis appear to be gradually fading. We expect that an upswing in housing construction, rising real estate and stock prices, and increasing availability of credit will help to spur a virtuous cycle of faster growth in employment, income, consumer spending, and business investment over the next few years. However, several policies that will help to bring down the budget deficit will also represent a drag on economic activity this year. The expiration of the 2 percentage point cut in the Social Security payroll tax, the increase in tax rates on income above certain thresholds, and the cuts in federal spending scheduled to take effect next month will mean reduced spending by both households and the government. We project that inflation-adjusted GDP will increase by about 1.5% in 2013, but that it would increase roughly 1.5 percentage points faster were it not for that fiscal tightening. Under current law, then, we expect that the unemployment rate will stay above 7.5% through next year. That would make 2014 the 6th consecutive year with unemployment so high, the longest such period since the 1930s. We expect that growth in real GDP will pick up after this year to about 3.5% per year in 2014 and the following few years. But the gap between the nation's GDP and what it is capable of producing on a sustained basis, what economists refer to as potential GDP, will still not close quickly. Under current law, we expect output to remain below its potential level until 2017, nearly a decade after the recession started in December 2007. The nation has paid and will continue to pay a big price for the recession and slow recovery. We estimate that the total loss in output relative to the economy's potential between 2007 and 2017 will be nearly equivalent to half of the total output produced in the country last year. Let me turn then to the budget. Under current laws, the federal budget deficit will shrink in 2013 for the 4th year in a row. At an estimated $845 billion, the deficit would be the first in 5 years below $1 trillion. And at 5.25% of GDP, only about half as large relative to the size of the economy as the deficit was in 2009. Our projections, based on current law, show deficits continuing to fall over the next few years before turning up again in the second half of the decade, and totaling nearly $7 trillion over the decade as a whole. Federal revenues are projected to reach 19% of GDP in 2015 and beyond because of both the expanding economy and scheduled changes in tax rules. That 19% figure compares to an average of about 18% over the past 40 years. At the same time, federal spending will fall relative to the size of the economy over the next several years and then rise again. The decline can be traced to the caps on discretionary funding and a drop-off in spending that tends to go up when the economy is weak, like unemployment benefits. But later in the decade, the return of interest rates to more normal levels will push up interest payments to nearly their highest share of GDP in 50 years. And throughout the decade, the aging of the population, a significant expansion of federal health care programs, and rising health care costs per person will push up spending on the largest federal programs. By 2023, spending reaches about 23% of GDP in our projection, compared with a 40-year average of about 21%. What does this mean for federal debt? We project that debt held by the public will reach 76% of GDP this year, the largest percentage since 1950. And under current laws, we project that debt in 2023 will be 77% of GDP, far higher than the 39% average of the past 40 years, and it will be on an upward path. Such high and rising debt relative to the size of the economy is a significant concern for several reasons. First, high debt means that the crowding out of capital investment will be greater, that you will have less flexibility to use tax and spending policies to respond to unexpected challenges like a recession or war, and that there will be a heightened risk of a fiscal crisis in which the government would be unable to borrow at affordable interest rates. Second, debt would be even larger if current laws were modified to delay or undo certain scheduled changes in policies. For example, if lawmakers eliminated the automatic spending cuts scheduled to take effect in March, but left in place the original caps from the Budget Control Act, if they prevented the sharp reduction in Medicare's payment rates for physicians scheduled to occur next January, and extended the tax provisions that are scheduled to expire, and if no offsetting changes were made, then budget deficits would be substantially larger than in our baseline projections, and debt held by the public would rise to 87% of GDP by 2023, rather than the 77% under current law. Third, debt might also be larger than in our projections because even the original caps on discretionary funding in the Budget Control Act would reduce such spending to just 5.8% of GDP in 2023, a smaller share than for any year in at least the past 50. Because the allocation of discretionary funding is determined, as you know, through annual appropriation acts, you and your colleagues have not yet decided which specific government services and benefits will be constrained or cut to meet those caps, and doing so might be quite difficult. Fourth, projections for the 10-year period covered in this report do not fully reflect long-term budget pressures. Because of the retirement of the baby boom generation and rising healthcare costs, a wide gap exists between the future costs of the benefits and services that people are accustomed to receiving from the federal government, especially in the form of benefits for older Americans, and the tax revenues that people have been sending to the government. It is possible to keep tax revenues at their historical average percentage of GDP, but only by making substantial cuts relative to current policies in the large benefit programs that aid a broad group of people at some point in their lives. Alternatively, it is possible to keep the policies for those large benefit programs unchanged, but only by raising taxes substantially for a broad segment of the population. Deciding now what combination of policy changes to make to resolve the budget imbalance would allow for gradual implementation of those changes, which would give households and businesses time to adjust their behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. Let me get into the debt itself. We had the State of the Union address last night, and as we all do, we go to the microphones and give our play-by-play analysis of what we thought of the speech and what we liked and what we didn't like. One thing stood out that gave me a real cause for concern. I heard it just with Mr. Van Hollen's opening statement, which gives me a very big cause for concern, which it seems as if they think the heavy lifting on debt reduction and deficit reduction is behind us, and we just got a little bit left, and then we're done. The notion that we've already got $2.5 trillion of deficit reduction taken care of, it's in the bank, we're not much farther to go to finish the job. This calculation, this $2.5 trillion of debt reduction, does not count the spending that took place during that time. It doesn't count the stimulus spending, $831 billion. It doesn't account for the first payroll tax holiday, $111 billion. It doesn't account for the second payroll tax holiday, $89 billion. It doesn't account for the multiple unemployment extensions. It doesn't account for the 24% increase in non-defense discretionary spending that occurred in the first 2 years of the administration. It doesn't account for the disaster spending that has taken place annually or the Sandy supplemental. It doesn't account for the debt servicing of all that additional spending. You wash it out, you net it out, and it's about $500 billion, roughly, of deficit reduction, not $2.5 trillion. But when you hear such projections which ignore the spending that occurred at the same time, I really worry that part of our government here, 2/3 of it, you know, the Senate and the White House, and our friends over on the other side of the aisle, are deluding themselves in thinking that this is taken care of. Look, you say in your own report here, publicly held debt has doubled from 36% of GDP at the close of 2007 to 73% on 2012, on pace to reach 77% by 2023. Your new, I guess this is your new alternate fiscal scenario, meaning doc fix all the other things you think Congress will do based on, you know, reasonable assumptions. We could go as high as 87% of GDP of publicly held debt. Total debt is already above 100% of GDP. If you could bring up chart 1. Here's the question I have. The green is what you said revenues are historically, about 18.3%. The blue line are all the tax increases the president has supported, endorsed. The loophole closers Mr. Van Hollen talks about, much of this has already been enacted. The fiscal cliff deal enacted a good portion of the blue, the revenues the president's calling for. The red are your projections on where spending is going. So even if we got every tax increase that the president has called for, we're not even scratching the surface. We're not even getting close to fixing this problem. And so the concern I have is a couple of things. What happens if we don't get this under control? What does a debt crisis look like? What happens to families? What happens to a nation if our debt continues on this burden? If we go to where your alternative fiscal scenario goes or where your baseline projection goes, if we don't actually turn this around, what happens? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, and I'm going to ask you this in writing, give me some different interest rate scenarios. What happens if interest rates rise faster than you're projecting? What happens to our ability to control our fiscal situation? What happens to our economy?
So, Mr. Chairman, let me just quickly clarify 2 points in what you said so people understand. We have not yet updated our long-term budget projections. I presume this slide is our new projections for the coming decade and your extrapolation beyond that. But it certainly is the case in our long-term outlook last year, and I presume will be true in our long-term outlook this year, that spending, particularly on the large healthcare programs and on Social Security, will continue to rise as a share of the economy over time, driven most importantly by the aging of our population and the rising number of eligible beneficiaries, and also due to other factors as well. The second point to clarify is that our alternative fiscal scenario is not meant to be a projection of what actually you and your colleagues will do. As you know, it is a projection of what current policies would cost. In fact, we all presume that you will make some changes in policies over the decade, but it is an additional benchmark that many of you have found helpful in the past, in addition to our standard presentation of what would happen under current law.
Because you have a new AFS baseline. What is the basic assumption? Because we have some new things that happen to deal with the fiscal cliff.
So people understand, our basic projections follow current law. That assumes, for example, now that the tax provisions scheduled to expire at the end of this year, many of which are routinely extended, our current law projection assumes they will expire. In our alternative scenario, we extend all those expiring tax provisions. Current law includes a cut in Medicare's payments to doctors at the end of this year. Congress has routinely pushed off that cut and made other changes in healthcare policy along the way. Our alternative scenario extrapolates the current payment rates to physicians. And current law includes the sequester, and many members of Congress have argued that they would like to do something different instead of that. So our alternative scenario takes away the sequester but leaves in place the original caps that Congress agreed to in August of 2011. So under the alternative scenario, total debt rises by about $2.5 trillion more over the coming decade than under the current law baseline projections. Mr. Chairman, you asked what happens if debt rises and stays high and rises. And there are some costs that I think that are quite predictable and other risks that are created. Over time, not under the current economic conditions, but under the conditions that we expect for later in the decade of nearly full employment in the economy, at that point in time, that large amount of debt will crowd out some private investment that would then raise wages and incomes. And by the more of that, the higher the debt is, the more of that investment is likely to be crowded out, and the greater the depressing effect on wages and incomes. Economists have models to capture that, and we report those sorts of estimates to you. But there are also risks that are involved. Some countries that have had very high levels of debt and have not communicated or have not persuaded their potential lenders that they have a plan for getting the debt under control have faced a fiscal crisis, which we've defined as a point at which a government is unable to borrow at affordable rates. Currently, our government is not at all in that position. Currently, interest rates, Treasury interest rates, are extraordinarily low. Our projection calls for a normalization of interest rates as the economy strengthens, as the Federal Reserve stops pushing so hard to keep interest rates low. We have a normalization of interest rates in our basic projections, but with debt high and rising, there is a greater risk that potential buyers of government debt will get spooked and will be unwilling to do so at the regular level of interest rates. If interest rates were a percentage point higher than we project over the entire decade, then the federal government's interest costs would be about $1.1 trillion higher. If interest rates were a percentage point lower than we project, then federal government's interest payments would be about $1.1 trillion lower. The point is that given the large amount of debt the federal government has and will have under current law for the coming decade, fairly small movements in interest rates can have fairly large effects on government interest payments.
What is your normalized rate assumption? I don't recall off the top.
So we are projecting that short-term interest rates rise to about 4%, and that longer-term 10-year Treasury note rates rise to 5.25%. Those rates, after adjusting for inflation, are a little above inflation-adjusted interest rates over the past several decades, reflecting, in our view, the effects of a higher level of debt relative to what we've experienced in past decades.
Well, so for the comedy of the committee, Mr. Van Hollen and I are limiting ourselves to 10 minutes. We don't always do that. We have a lot of people here, so I'll be brief only to say that it seems we have this window that is beginning to narrow on us. As you mentioned, America is right now, with respect to the bond markets, the port in the storm, the safe haven. We're the world's reserve currency. That gives us a privilege. That gives us time. But if we fritter this time away, if we don't deal with the core problem, which is spending, no matter what you try to do on revenues, then we will have lost this opportunity we have to get our fiscal house in order while we have lower interest rates. The other problem, as we see it, is growth. If we keep chasing higher spending with higher taxes, we will sacrifice growth. The best way is to get people back to work in good jobs, with good wages, paying taxes, and getting spending under control. And so when we talk about taxes and tax reform, this is something for the Ways and Means Committee, but something we'll discuss here, loopholes are part of tax reform. Closing loopholes, which is what we proposed for years, is a necessary pay for to get tax rates down, to have a globally competitive tax code, to help businesses, to create jobs, to get people back to work. And if we use loopholes to chase higher spending, then we're foregoing tax reform and missing our opportunity for economic growth. That I just want to make very clear for the record, because I think we'll hear a lot of political rhetoric to the contrary. And with that, I want to yield to Mr. Van Hollen for his 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, welcome, Dr. Elmendorf. First, just a little bit on the math. The chairman pointed out that while we will have $1.5 trillion in cuts over the next 10 years as a result of the spending caps, there were some other one-time spending measures. He included in those spending measures actually the payroll tax cut, which was probably the biggest single item in that issue, and there was actually agreement that given tough economic times, it was important to provide a payroll tax relief. I actually think we should have phased that out rather than having gone cold turkey. But the point is, a big chunk of that number had to do with lost revenue from a payroll tax cut that was supported by a great majority in this body. As I said in my opening remarks, I think that our overall objective here in the short, medium, and long term needs to be expanding the economy, growing jobs, and having a strong middle class. So it's absolutely true that especially as the economy recovers, if you continue to have high deficits, it will squeeze out that private investment and put upward pressure on interest rates. So in order to make sure we have good long-term economic growth, we have to grapple with the deficit. That just brings us back to the question of how we deal with the deficit. And as Dr. Elmendorf pointed out, you can have sort of two categorical ways. One, you could say, well, you're not going to do any revenue. You're going to do it all in cuts. And as he pointed out, you can do it all on, revenue, no cuts. Both of those lead, in our view, to bad results. You can't raise revenue enough realistically to cover all those costs, but cutting, as Dr. Elmendorf said, means undermining important commitments that we've made when it comes to retirement and health security for our seniors. So again, the question is how we deal with those deficits. Now, let me get back to the sequester issue because that's looming right now. Could you tell me, Dr. Elmendorf, in terms of the negative economic impact of the sequester, the 0.6%, what does that translate into in terms of lost jobs?
So our estimate is, as the Congressman says, that the sequester alone will reduce GDP growth this year by 0.6 percentage points, lowering the level of GDP at the end of the year by that 0.6%. We think that would reduce the level of employment at the end of the year by about 750,000 jobs.
750,000 jobs between now and the end of this calendar year, 2013, right?
Yes, Congressman.
That's a whole lot of jobs, obviously, and we should be working overtime to prevent that kind of job loss. Now, if you were to replace the deficit reduction through that austerity program, the Meat Act's cuts to the sequester, with a plan that accomplished the same amount of deficit reduction spread over the 10-year period, you would not have that big hit on jobs. Isn't that right?
That's right, Congressman.
Right. Now, we've also heard a lot about the impact as a result of the defense cuts. And I should point out, this is not sort of just the Congressional Budget Office analysis, our analysis. The Republican leader, Mr. Cantor, had it exactly right last September on the floor of the House when he said that if we allowed that sequester to take place, quote, unemployment would soar, unquote. It would set back progress on the economy. And he cited an estimate that the sequester would cost 200,000 jobs in the state of Virginia alone. That was if the sequester for the full year went over. We were able to prevent the sequester for the first 2 months through a balanced approach, I should say, a combination of cuts and revenue. That should be the model going forward, and that's the model that we've applied to prevent the sequester. Now, just to be clear, since there's been a lot of attention focused on the jobs lost because of defense cuts, the cuts in the non-defense as a result of the sequester, on a dollar-for-dollar basis, does that result in the same amount of jobs lost?
The effects of cuts in defense spending and non-defense spending will be quite similar dollar for dollar. The precise timing of the economic effects depends on the timing of which the defense spending and non-defense spending occurs. So in some circumstances, there could be small differences. But basically, Congressman, you're right, that if the government is paying people to build battleships or paying people to build other sorts of equipment or structures, then those will have comparable effects, dollar for dollar, on the economy, on output, and on jobs.
Right. I've never understood the logic as to how cuts to defense, meaning you're not building as many tanks or battleships, somehow cost jobs, but cuts to other government spending somehow do not cost jobs. I mean, obviously, when you invest money to build roads and bridges and other transportation systems, you're putting people to work doing things that are productive for our economy. If it's scientists at NIH or other people around the country, those are grants that are being spent to try and find treatments and cures for life-saving diseases. It would be absolutely counterproductive in terms of our long-term competitiveness, let alone the health of our people, to have those kind of cuts take place. And on top of that, those long-term negative impacts, you've got the job loss, 750,000 jobs between now and the end of the month. Let me just say something, Dr. Elmendorf, about the tax reform. I don't know if you've done a recent estimate of the amount of tax expenditures in the tax code. What's your most recent estimate. And
So we, in last year's Outlook, which was a longer document since we had a little more time, we had a extended discussion of tax expenditures. We have not updated that this year, but the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation has released a new estimate, I believe, of tax expenditures, or certainly one, they're working on one. And tax expenditures amount to a very large amount of money, and I think many economists agree that they are really best viewed as a form of government spending because they are directed at particular people or entities or designed to subsidize particular activities, very much analogous to the way that government spending is often directed at particular people or entities or designed to subsidize particular activities. Right. So it is essentially a large component of spending by the federal government, even though it is recorded essentially as lost revenue on the revenue side of the budget.
That's right. I mean, it's spending through the tax code by saying to certain interests, sometimes based on policies we agree there's consensus on, sometimes not, that's revenue that will not come into the Treasury to help reduce the deficit. And the chairman pointed out that we passed the $600 billion tax increase focused on folks at the very high end of the income scale. But as the president pointed out in the talks with the speaker, his goal was actually to achieve $1.2 trillion in revenue, which I would point out to our colleagues is less revenue embedded in that plan than in the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles plan, which said we should do tax reform, but in addition to reducing the rates, we should have a significant amount go to deficit reduction. In fact, the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Commission report would have a lot more revenue coming in than the president has proposed. I just want to make that clear to our colleagues. I would also point out that Speaker Boehner, during those discussions with the president, said he didn't want to increase rates, but he could raise $800 billion by closing these tax loopholes and breaks and getting rid of these tax expenditures. Those are all still there. None of the actions we've taken eliminate those tax breaks and tax expenditures that the speaker was talking about, that all the candidates in the last presidential election talked about. And so if we agree, Mr. Chairman, that those are just different forms of spending in the tax code, it seems to me we should be willing to help eliminate some of those tax expenditures for the purpose of reducing the deficit in a balanced way. And just to be clear, what our colleagues to date have said is they're not willing to do that. They're not willing to eliminate any of those tax expenditures, spending the tax code, for the purpose of reducing the deficit. And we think that's important as part of a balanced plan combined with targeted cuts, reforms, going forward. The last point I would say is if you look at the chairman's chart, there's no doubt, we have to deal with this issue. But as you know, you can pass changes to laws in this 10-year window that have a very important impact in the out years, which is, of course, what your budget did last time. Arbitrarily trying to squeeze all of that into the 10-year window, which apparently was what the Speaker had to agree to do as part of extending the 3-month debt ceiling, is not good economics. That's politics. And so I would hope that as we go through this process, we keep an eye on the point I raised at the beginning. What's the impact on the economy? Short term, middle term, long term. What's the impact on the middle class and jobs? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. I would say balancing the budget is good economics, but I guess we just disagree on that. Dr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me follow up quickly on that.
Tomorrow?
Mr. Director, welcome
Thank you.
back to the committee. We appreciate your insight, your input. Is it better to have a balanced budget than not?
Well, Congressman, I think that depends on what your values are. The reason that CBO doesn't make recommendations about budget policy is because the course that you and your colleagues choose depends not just on the sort of analysis we can provide, but on your judgments.
The level of debt that you described, 76% public debt held right now, 87% going under, I guess, your alternative fiscal scenario. I suspect you would agree that a level of 87% is not as wise as a level of 76%, giving the propensity for a fiscal crisis at 87 being higher than 76. Is that right?
Yes, we certainly agree that the higher debt has higher expected costs and higher risks than lower debt would have.
Good. And I would concur. I want to touch briefly on the fiscal cliff, the $600 billion increase in taxes with that. Do you recall what the spending reductions were in that legislation, the net spending reductions?
Well, so Congressman, remember that the way that the cost estimate that we produced, and we produce for all bills, is relative to current law.
Yes.
So our cost estimate showed that legislation as a very large tax cut, not the tax increase that you've just described.
Yes.
There were only small changes in spending. I don't remember how they netted out. There was an additional spending on Medicare, but cutbacks in other healthcare spending. The sequester was deferred. That was paid for partly, as you know, through other spending reductions
Like
and partly
minimal
through tax
spending
increases.
reductions in the fiscal cliff bill. So this balanced approach that our friends on the other side of the aisle talk about is balanced until it isn't, and that's what we saw with the fiscal cliff. I want to touch on the whole issue of revenue. Your report cites that revenue has returned essentially in 2012 to the 08 levels, or higher than the 10-year average, basically. Is that accurate?
That may well be right. I'm sorry, I don't have all that history in front of me, Congressman.
I think that's correct. The revenue to the federal government now has returned to higher than the 10-year average. That being the case, and if we look at the deficit in 2008 at about $450 billion, and the deficit in 2012 at $1.3 trillion, with revenue returning essentially to 2008 levels, then isn't it true that the thing that's driving the deficit to a greater degree at this point is not that the revenues are lower than they have been, but that spending is higher than it has been? Is that an accurate statement?
Well, certainly in dollar terms, Congressman, you're right that spending is going up very sharply. I think the problem that you and your colleagues face is that from the perspective of many Americans who are now starting to retire in the baby boom generation, there are benefits that they are expecting individually. The fact that there are many more of them than there were beneficiaries 10 and 20 years ago doesn't appear to them as an excess of the benefits they're getting, but it turns out you take a given benefit and multiply by a lot more people,
Yes.
that the aggregate spending goes up, and that's, I think, the challenge you and your colleagues face, is how to respond to that.
And it is indeed, and we look forward to working through a budgetary process that will save and strengthen and secure those programs, as opposed to move in the direction of essentially lopping off funding for those programs at the expense of those beneficiaries. That's a debate that we will have. I want to touch again back on the 76%, 87%. Your alternative fiscal scenario has really been more, in the past, has really been more accurate compared to reality. Is that a true statement?
I suppose that's true. I mean, the single biggest difference, as you know, between that and the baseline had been the extension of these expiring tax provisions. And in fact, the Congress chose about a month ago to extend most of those expiring tax provisions. So in that sense, our current baseline looks more like our last alternative scenario than like our last baseline.
So if passed as prologue, then it's more likely that we will be closer to 87% public debt held as opposed to 76%. And if that's
again, I think if you and your colleagues let current policies stand, that would be the case. Whether you will or not is the issue that you're debating.
the question I want to get to is when a fiscal crisis occurs, when a debt crisis occurs, what's the triggering mechanism? What happens that results in that? The inability to borrow at an affordable rate, as you described it.
I think a loss of confidence in the government's ability to manage its affairs and to pay the interest on the debt makes potential investors more concerned and makes them expect higher risk premiums.
Which is not a predictable moment in time. Is that accurate?
That's right, Congressman.
Thank you.
Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, and welcome to a new budget cycle. So pleased to be back. And there's really keen and important debates that we're having for our country. And I did want to thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for being here and outlining where we are. You did point to some positive news. I appreciate that. The fact that we are in recovery, that we are seeing some very positive signs in economic growth, the housing sector you pointed out. And that, of course, you've heard already the disagreement that is making it very difficult to find a way to actually reduce the deficit in a fair and balanced way that strengthens the middle class, that grows jobs, that does not hurt this fragile economic recovery. We've seen economic growth. We saw the arguments at the end of last year that I saw a contraction in the economy for the first time in 3 years, was it? So, you know,
Yes.
it's significant. The debates we have here have an effect. And of course, we believe that this is not just politics. There are very different economic theories about how we grow this economy, how we strengthen the middle class, how we actually are economically competitive in a global marketplace, and how we meet our obligations, not only to our children and our future, but the obligations you and I have talked a good bit about, and we've talked about on this committee, and that is to our seniors. And that's what I wanted to ask you about. One of the things that we have seen, again, positive news this week, you pointed it out, CBO has pointed out, the Department of Human Services pointed out, and some of the private sector institutes have pointed out, that in fact we have seen slower growth in the costs of healthcare in both the private sector and in the public sector.
Yes.
That are really, is quite significant. When I came in here, we had double-digit growth in costs in the healthcare sector for a decade, 100% increase and more in both the private sector, and particularly in the private sector, more so than the public sector. But in Medicare and Medicaid, and I think that some of us would contend that we have seen these delivery system reforms and a very serious commitment that we have made to really push the healthcare system, both doctors and hospitals, to give us better value for our taxpayer dollar, to improve the quality of healthcare for our seniors, to deliver healthcare in a much more cost-efficient way, and as a result, save taxpayer dollars and improve the quality of our seniors' healthcare. So particularly given the demographic problems around Medicare, those baby boomers, 10,000 more seniors a day, it's serious business. But could you speak to the fact that you have found, again, we've seen other reports that have said we have seen very good reduction. A 3% growth rate is really quite something when we've seen 10% a year in Medicare. Is there, I'll ask, you confirm that, but I will also ask that as we move, which is the intention, I'll say I have legislation to do it as well, which is to move the way we pay physicians in this country, not just repeal SGR, but to actually change the way we reimburse all physicians under Medicare, that would require them to pick a model that does save money and improve quality and outcomes for our seniors, has the potential, and I hope you can actually document that if we said all physicians in this country move in that direction, the potential cost savings and cost containment, not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector.
Yes, let me first quickly emphasize the point you made about the effects of the retirement of the baby boom generation, because the numbers are really quite striking. We think that by 2023, there'll be roughly 40% more beneficiaries of Social Security and Medicare than there were last year. 40% more people, roughly. And that has a tremendous effect, obviously, on the overall cost of those programs.
We've made a commitment to those seniors that many of us expect to meet, so.
Your point, Congresswoman, about healthcare cost growth is absolutely right. There's been a marked slowing in Medicare, in Part A that mostly pays for hospital care, in Part B that pays for physicians, in Part D that pays for drugs, and in Medicaid and in the private sector in the rate of health cost growth. We and other analysts think that part of that is because of the recession and the slow growth of income and loss of wealth that's reduced people's willingness to pay money for health care. But we think that a significant part of it is, in fact, structural. The crucial question is whether those structural changes are transient or will be enduring. And that's a topic that we're giving a lot of thought to and talking with outside experts. I think the right way to summarize the consensus is that we don't know.
If we were to pass legislation this year, before the SGR expires, or that would go into effect again and see that kind of cuts. If we actually pass legislation, which honestly there's been really serious and good discussion between Democrats and Republicans on my bill on an innovative way to pay physicians under Medicare, would that give you the tools to be able to say this is actually going to happen, this is the window when it's going to happen, this is the direction we're moving in?
I think there's widespread support, Congresswoman, for the idea that we should be paying healthcare providers in a different way than we're paying them today. And I think widespread agreement that a shift in how we pay providers can improve both the quality of care and keep costs down. Exactly what changes in federal law will lead to what particular outcomes is a very uncertain business, and we look forward to continuing to work with you on that.
Thank you. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you again, Dr. Elmendorf. So large and persistent deficits, like we have over the long term, are a bad thing for economic growth, job creation, and potentially have the debt crisis risk that you discussed, right?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay, but the solution to that, which is some kind of fiscal contraction, be it either through tax increases or spending reduction, can cause a reduction in short-term economic growth and/or job creation.
Yes, exactly, Congressman.
So we're in a bit of a pickle.
Yes, Congressman.
And so the question is, how do we get out of this thing? Now, in Europe, Greeks and Spanish and Italians waited too long, and they had to do a substantial fiscal contraction in a very short period of time, which resulted in extremely high unemployment and large contraction in their GDP. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, other factors have been at work as well, Congressman. But
Right,
yes,
but
we think that the sharp fiscal austerity in some countries in Europe has contracted their economies.
Right. If we were to decide to try and fix this whole budget deficit in the next 2 years, or if we were forced to do it by debt crisis, that would plunge the country into recession. Unemployment would go up worse than it is today. Bad things.
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. So we don't want to do that. But if we ignore it, or we only deal with just a little bit of it, and the deficits go on as you show in the baseline, or even worse in the alternative scenario, then we risk never getting to our potential growth and potentially have that debt crisis where a few years from now we'd have to make that kind of overnight contraction.
Yes, Congressman, that's a risk, absolutely.
So it makes a whole lot of sense to try and solve this thing in not too short a time and not too long a time, which, and I don't know whether you feel comfortable answering this or not, but you know, if 2 or 3 years is too short and not dealing it or looking at 30 years is too long, is somewhere in 8 to 12 years, if it were done in an even approach, is that the sort of thing that might be able to balance and get us out of this pickle with as little damage as possible and as much opportunity for growth?
I really don't want to prescribe a particular time path, Congressman, as you know, but I think you're absolutely right that the risk of waiting longer is that by running with a high level of debt to GDP or a rising level of debt to GDP, the costs build up and the risks build up. And in 2007, debt was 36% of GDP. By the end of this year, it will have risen by 40% of GDP, we project, to 76% of GDP, because of the financial crisis and the recession and the actions taken in response to them. If we run at this higher level of debt and encounter another crisis domestically or internationally, that room to expand the deficit will not be there in the way it has been over the last half dozen years.
Right, okay. Just a couple other things here in my final couple of minutes. Mr. Van Hollen talked about the sequester and replacing it 1-year cuts over something that will be over 10 years. If you were to replace the sequester with whatever, just a similar amount that matched year for year what the sequester is, of other spending cuts and or tax increases, and I understand the composition would have something to do with it, but if you do $100 billion of fiscal contraction, there's some negative impact upon the economy, no matter where that fiscal contraction comes from.
Yes, I think that's right, Congressman. You're just right that the timing is critical for the economic effects. The composition can also matter depending on just how you and your colleagues do it.
Right, but if we put it off, we're putting off the problem that we've discussed we have to deal with. One final thing on tax expenditures. I hate that term, but and I know you economists like it, but let's just call it tax deductions, credits, whatever. Is not the vast majority of those, if you look at home mortgage interest, charitable contribution, IRAs, 401ks, other retirement plans, and health care, isn't that where, I mean, if you really wanted to make a big impact, you'd have to go into those things, would you not?
Congressman, you're absolutely right. Those are the largest components. How big an impact one could make dealing with other pieces we haven't quite assessed. But in this nice chart we had last year, the single largest tax expenditure relates to health care, principally the exclusion of health insurance from taxable income. And the second largest involves pensions, and the third largest involves mortgage interest.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Elmendorf.
Thank you, Congressman.
Mr. Pasquarello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for coming before us again and opening up the pleasant season for the next 2 years. I think that I want to respond to my brother from Georgia, what he said before. about how we have increased spending since 2008, beginning January 2009 when President Obama raised his hand. I think we're all here to roll up our sleeves and find a long-term solution to the debt. But just as we know that increased revenue is not going to solve the entire problem by any stretch, neither we can't cut our way out of our budget difficulties either. So when you look at what's happened in terms of budget since 2009, January 2009, and now, when there was an increase in spending, we can't just talk about that out of context. Why was there an increase in spending? Are we spending just to spend, or was this the government's response, our response, whether you voted for it or not, to a very serious problem in the United States of America? People out of work, healthcare costs going through the roof. So how do we do it? If no one else is spending, if we don't have private capital invested, and that started before the end of 2008, then how do you try to provide an atmosphere so that there is investment into the economy? And we want private investment. We know the government can't solve every problem. We understand that very, very well. But when you talk about a balanced budget, of course it's preferable. But are we to think that because we had this tremendous deficit problem going into 2009, that all we needed to do was cut across the board in view of the social and cultural things that were going on in this country, and by the way, much of the world? Are we to think that if we simply cut and slashed, that everything be fine? You have created a nemesis. You have created a situation where you want folks to think that you want to protect their tax dollar when you know very, very well that in 2009 we had tremendous unemployment and that the government didn't do anything. If there was no recovery, and we could point out chapter and verse where recovery helped in creating jobs. And now, what happened in the last quarter of last year? Very interesting comparisons. So we had to come out of 2 wars. We never paid for them. We had to come out of 2 major tax cuts of 2001 and 2003. We never paid for that either. We didn't even pay for the prescription drug plan that we passed 8 years ago. There's a reason why we had to spend that money. And if anyone is trying to imply here that if we simply stop spending the money, isn't that wonderful? And it is our money. It's the taxpayers' money. That we would be in better economic shape. Well, American people didn't buy that in the last election. They just simply did not buy, because they're a lot smarter than we think they are. All of us, included, both sides of the aisle. Both sides of the aisle. So instead of a trickle-down economics, which we had for 8 years, and we'll go into how many jobs are created then and how many jobs have been created over the last 4 years. Instead of going to trickle-down, we got a trickle-up. I prefer trickle-up. I prefer that the little guy have a shot at prosperity and not wait for the big guys to drive this economy, because they certainly flopped on their face in 2007 and 2008 when capital was not invested in this country. Director Elmendorf, it seems to me that the most important way to achieve long-term deficit reduction is a balanced approach of revenue and spending cuts. That's what we keep on talking about. And in fact, according to your report this month, the CBO expects the deficit to shrink from 8.7% of GDP, because we don't want to quote these things because it doesn't fit into our script, that will shrink to 5.3%. Is that correct?
Thank you, time.
Yes, Congressman.
Can you at least answer the question?
You know, we got a lot of people here. He said yes. But if we wait until the clock is at 0 to ask our question, we're not going to get to these other members who are waiting patiently for their turn.
Your point is
Mr.
well
McClintock.
taken, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elmendorf, Dr. Elmendorf, let's get to some basics here first. In order to pay for spending, we either tax it now or we borrow it now and tax it later. Are there any other ways of spending, I mean, other than monetary policy, which is itself simply a tax on existing capital?
Well, the amount by which you raise taxes later depends on the level of debt that you are willing to
But you
support in the
either
country.
borrow it or you tax it, if you're going to spend it.
Yes, Congressman.
All right, so government really cannot inject a dollar into the economy that it's not first taken out of the same economy, either by taxing now or borrowing now and taxing to repay it in the future.
I think, Congressman, that under our current economic conditions, if the government borrows money, it is not taking a dollar out that would otherwise be invested. It can, in fact, increase the total demand for goods and services in the economy and thereby boost employment.
If the dollar
and
is
output.
being borrowed by the government, presumably it is not there then to be borrowed by a consumer seeking to make consumer purchases, or a home buyer seeking to re-enter the housing market, or a small business seeking to expand jobs.
So I think that logic is exactly right, Congressman, at a point where the economy is at full employment, but that's
let's
not
get to
the
that.
current economic circumstances.
Now, would you explain the economic impact of debt?
So in a fully employed economy of the sort that we project for the second half of the coming decade, then higher debt, as I mentioned, crowds out private investment and reduces incomes relative to what they would otherwise be. In an economy like one we have today, the effects are starkly different. In an economy like one we have today, we think that additional borrowing to support higher spending or tax cuts would provide a boost to the economy in the short term. Certainly, if that extra borrowing is not paid down later, it will weigh on the
again,
economy later, but in the
but
short
you're
term, it will provide a
borrowing-
boost to the economy.
But you're borrowing a dollar from the same capital market that would otherwise be funding loans to consumers or to businesses or to home buyers, for example. So it's the same dollar. The only question is whether it is borrowed by the government to spend or is borrowed by somebody in the productive sector to spend.
But under current conditions, Congressman, the demand for private borrowing is very low. There isn't a conflict in the credit markets. That's why the federal government's interest rates are so low right now. Under other conditions, there would be more of a competition for funds of the
Well,
sort
I
you're
would-
describing, but
I
these
would
conditions
suggest-
are unusual.
I would suggest you talk to some small business people who are desperately trying to get loans, or home buyers who are desperately trying to get loans, and they're telling us they can't get them. Now, tell us about the economic impact of spending, or pardon me, of taxes, rather.
So taxes can have two kinds of effects. One is they just take money that households would otherwise have to spend. The other is they can affect the incentives for people to work and to save. And in our macroeconomic modeling, we try to capture both of those sorts of effects.
In fact, didn't your office estimate that the tax increases back to the Clinton-era rates on those earning $200,000 as individuals, $250,000 as couples, would cost about 200,000 jobs?
That sounds roughly right, Congressman. I don't remember the specifics. You're referring to a report, I think, on the fiscal cliff from last fall. I don't remember the precise numbers.
Now, we're also told by your office that the sequester reductions in spending would affect about 0.6% of growth. You said about 750,000 jobs, because government would not be spending that money on creating government jobs. But as we've just established, government doesn't inject a dollar into the economy that's not first taken out of the economy. So I'm afraid we're getting to a situation where we're being told that tax increases are bad for the economy, too much borrowing's bad for the economy, particularly in the future that you're projecting, and spending cuts are bad for the economy, and that doesn't leave us with many options.
So, Congressman, I think the effects of fiscal policy on the economy are different under different economic circumstances. That is a widely held, not universally held, but a widely held view among economists, and that's the perspective that we take. So under current economic circumstances, when private demand for goods and services is low, additional government demand through higher spending or the government spurring additional private demand through lower taxes can both increase the overall demand for goods and services and thus encourage businesses to hire more. Under different economic circumstances of the sort that we usually have in this country and that we expect we will have again, 5 and 10 years from now, then there is more, then this competition you're describing between the government's use of funds and the private sector's use of funds can become acute. And that's why under those economic circumstances, smaller government deficits are good for the economy.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott.
I've asked them to put up a chart on the screen so that you can, a picture's always worth 1,000 words, and it's good to see you, Mr. Elmendorf. Your budget analysis is very interesting. For years, we've had to listen to the Republicans lighting their hair on fire on cable TV about the temporary large deficits we have. We were told if Simpson Bowles was not enacted, it'd be the end of the world as we know it. 2 years later, we're going right along. And in fact, if you'll notice on that chart, the jobs are going up. We've had 35 months of people increasing. And the only places you see dips, if you check them out, are when the Republicans began to play roulette with the budget, when they created chaos about whether we were going to pay our bills internationally, or we have these big fights we have on the floor. The unemployment goes up because business doesn't have any confidence. They're not going to hire anybody. And it seems to me that what you said is that the long-term problems in this country really are about health care costs, as Ms. Schwartz has already pointed out. When I came to Congress in 1988, we were talking about the big problem that was going to come in 2011. Well, it's here. The baby boomers are now enrolling in Medicare, and it's going to go from 40 to 60 million. And it's been absolutely predictable, and nobody wanted to deal with it until it's now. It's nothing new. It's not we're suddenly having massive spending, except we are honoring our commitments to the people in this country. And it seems to me that the issue really here is whether we're going to tear the safety net out, say to seniors, we're not going to cover you, you're on your own, you and your family, go find out whatever you want. But what's interesting is I think we have a triumph to talk about, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Medicare spending, as I understand it, is flat per person. Is that correct?
I don't have those precise numbers in front of me, but you're certainly right, Congressman. It has slowed very sharply in the past few years from what it was before.
And in my reading of your analysis, at least you give some credit, if not a good bit of credit, to the fact that we enacted the Affordable Care Act. Is that correct?
So, Congressman, we have not attributed the slowdown to any particular factors like the Affordable Care Act. What we've said is that we think part of it is related to the recession, part of it is structural. The structural part could have a number of possible causes. One could be providers thinking about the current and incipient effects of the Affordable Care Act, but they also are driven by pressures from private insurers. I think providers are driven by their own sense that they're not providing care in as efficient a way as possible. And we have not tried at this point we've tried to think through, but we have not said anything because we don't know about what factors are driving the structural changes. If we understood better what factors are driving them, we'd understand better what the prognosis was as well.
That's my point. If you pass a law, even the threat of passing the law under the Clinton administration, suddenly healthcare costs kind of leveled off. And again, we see it when the Congress acts that we basically see the flattening of costs. Now, you can't directly tie it, point A to point B, but you know that the whole United States is watching what the Congress is doing. And when we don't pay our debts, they stop hiring. That's clear. I mean, you could look right at the graph and trace it down to the time when it happened, and you can see how it happens. I think that the thing that's most amazing about this is that the industry, the medical industrial complex, is actually responding because they know it's not sustainable. And my question to you is, the effect of throwing people off of Medicare or let's raise the age to 67 or 70 before you can get on. What would that affect? How would that affect the economy? You have an idea?
Oh, Congressman, it depends a lot on what else is going on and exactly how that provision would be structured. We wrote a report early last year about the effects of raising the eligibility age for Social Security and for Medicare. And we talked about the consequences. Certainly some people who aren't on Medicare would end up on other federal health care programs. Some people we think would end up without insurance. Some people would choose to work longer to maintain their employer-sponsored health insurance. So there's a whole combination of responses that we think would occur.
So the real issue here is, how do we control healthcare costs?
Thank you.
I think it's a very important question, obviously, Congressman.
Mr. Garrett.
Greetings, and this will follow up on our private conversation initially, and maybe some of the points that, while I was out of the room, with regard to interest rates. And so the one number that I heard, maybe somebody threw this out to you, because you were saying that we're at here now, basically 0, right? Projection over the 10-year going up around 3, and so the interest payment on the debt is going to increase during that period of time. I think the one number that you threw out to us is $1.1 trillion for a 1% increase in interest. Now you base that, you basically factor that in to your projections over the 10-year. I mean, going from 0 up to 3.
Right, so the increase in interest rates that we show is the underlying feature of our projection of federal interest payments.
Right. So one of the other uncertainties is the maturation dates that the Fed has on the securities going out, that it's an inverted, right, between long and short. Do you take that into consideration as well? In other words, one of the numbers I heard was that you look at a 3% increase in 3%, you would look at around $140 billion increase in year 1, and that would only last for 2 to 3 years as the maturation date changes for the securities. You with me on that?
Well, so you're right, Congressman, that our projections of the government's interest payments depend not just on the level of interest rates at that moment in time in the financial markets, but what the federal government has issued when it is rolling over those maturing securities into new securities.
And so I guess one of the multiple bottom lines is this, is that we're going through the whole sequester issue, trying to save roughly $100 billion, $86 billion with interest payments, and that basically pales into comparison if interest rates go up just 1%.
Yes, that's right, Congressman. Now, a 1 percentage point higher level of interest rates for the entire decade would be a sizable
change. We could do everything. We could do
but
everything a sizable change, but and a historically accurate change. In other words, we're historically low in numbers right now. People.
Yeah, I mean, above and beyond the increase, I was suggesting that we have built into our projection, which is a return of interest rates to slightly above their historical average level. Further increases are certainly possible, but I'm just noting that the percentage point difference for the entire decade is a fairly large difference.
Right. Let me just turn real quick over to the FHA. The FHA revealed in their housing agency reports that cash reserves are down 45% from last year, and chances of future losses on the current outstanding portfolio could exceed 50%, is not out of the norm, which would require potentially that the taxpayers would have to bail out the FHA going forward. Furthermore, the report shows from the FHA that they are over-leveraged right now. They're at a leverage ratio of 400 to 1, which sort of makes Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and the rest sort of pale, and the GSEs even pale in comparison. Have you examined the FHA's report and the budgetary implications on that in your projections?
So let me say 2 things, Congressman, quickly. First, as you know, when you refer to a government bailout, there's no explicit action by the Congress that would be required. It's simply the case that if people don't pay back their mortgages, and the FHA is on the hook, that taxpayers will suffer those losses.
They have a line of credit to the Treasury. They have to come to Congress, but the Treasury can basically give them the money without us authorizing it. Did you take that into consideration?
Yeah, so the second thing I would say is that, as you know, again, but to explain to others, there's a few years of FHA lending that has turned out particularly poorly in terms of the delinquency and default rates. And we have not done a separate projection of what the draw on the Treasury might ultimately be. If there is a change, it would turn up as you know, as a credit re-estimate in the budget. But we don't have a specific projection that I'm aware of what the FHA financial system would be.
Is that something that you could do and take a look at?
I think we could take a closer look at it. Yes, we have to talk with you more specifically, and I don't know about the data that we can get. But yes, we could try.
That would be very helpful to us over in financial services and appropriate as well. So last question is with regard to Medicare. As you well know, that there's a law in place that says when costs exceed revenues by 45%, something has to happen, right? That President has to issue a report on how to solve the problem, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and so has that ever been triggered?
So that threshold has been exceeded for a number of years, I think,
Was
Congressman.
that triggered in '09?
I don't know the precise years, Congressman, but I would take your word for
Would
it.
you believe that '09, 2010, 2011, 2012?
I would believe it, Congressman.
Have you ever
yes.
scored the President's proposal in response to that?
We've never scored a specific response to that. We've estimated the President's health proposals in other ways.
Has the President ever, as required by law, provided a report as required in the law?
I'm not aware of any,
So he has
Congressman.
violated the law in that sense?
I'm not a lawyer, Congressman.
But he was required to do so.
There is a requirement for a proposal to be made. I'm not aware of any proposals having been made, but I may be unaware, and I'm not in a
But you
position
would
to
have
speak to the
scored it.
legalities.
You would have scored it had he done it, would have you not?
Gentlemen,
Well, it depends. As you know, we estimate the President's budget once a year. Otherwise, we estimate things that you and your colleagues bring to us, not
Thank you,
things from
Dr.
the
Elmendorf.
administration directly.
gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say it's an honor to serve on this committee, and I hope to work with this committee to create a useful roadmap for the American people, one that will create jobs, lift people out of poverty and into the middle class, grow our economy for everyone, and reduce the deficit. And let me thank you, Mr. Director, for your testimony and for being here. Our budget is not only a roadmap to fiscal responsibility, but it's also a moral document. It shines light on what the priorities are of our government and who we are as a country. Our nation's budget must reflect our values, and it must raise enough revenue so that we can invest in our people and meet our nation's challenges head on. While our economy continues to slowly recover, I believe we also must focus on lifting the millions of Americans who are living in poverty up the economic ladder and into the middle class. And so in addition to looking at policies that strengthen the middle class, I will continue as a member of this committee to remind this committee that nearly 50 million people live in poverty, 16 million are children, and this is unacceptable. Now, unless Congress acts by March 1st, the sequester will slash thousands of jobs, which we've heard earlier, and economic security of the middle class, but it will also push the poor and low-income individuals really over the edge. It will eviscerate any gains our recovering economy has made in recent years. And so there's no question that we need to prevent these cuts from taking place, and we must do so in a way that protects investments that create and continue this economic growth. So I think we need to take a hard look at the loopholes and tax expenditures in our tax code that allow some of the wealthiest individuals and businesses to not pay their fair share, but also we need to look at the ongoing waste, fraud, and abuse going on over at the Pentagon. And so, you know, I can't for the life of me figure out how we can budget when the single largest discretionary item on our budget cannot be audited. We need the Pentagon to pass an audit so we can get to know where the money and where our tax dollars are going and adequately set priorities. Now, let me just ask you about the CBO report on the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. I'd like to just ask you, Mr. Director, can you explain how our government's targeted investment in the American people and in our nation's critical infrastructure, how that created jobs and how it helped to begin to grow the economy? And also, if we invested in a program that provided coordinated benefits and social services that lifted the long-term economic stability and incomes, let's say half of families living in poverty, what impact would that be, and what impact, would that have overall in terms of our economic growth?
So, Congresswoman, as you know, we have estimated consistently for the past 4 years that the Recovery Act, taking effect at the time it did with the economic circumstances the country faced, increased output and jobs relative to what would have happened in the absence of the Recovery Act. And we think it did that by some additional direct government purchases, by giving money to state and local governments that they then use to purchase goods and services or to provide benefits, and by cutting taxes to Americans that let them then spend more money themselves. And that additional demand for goods and services filled in part, only part, but part of the great shortfall in demand that had come about in the wake of the bursting of the housing bubble and the financial crisis. So we think the path of output and employment has been higher than it would have been otherwise because of that act. And we think that this year, with an economy stronger but not that strong yet, that easing of fiscal policy, such as a deferral of the sequester, would boost output and employment this year relative to what would occur under current law. You also asked about longer-term effects of policy. I think those effects are ones that we worry about but are harder to know for sure. So if the government can strengthen people's skills, help them have better education and more training, that should make them more productive over time. But the overall economic effects will also depend on how the government does that and where the money comes from to do it. So spending $1 in a certain place can be good for the economy, but in the longer run, it does come out of something else. And to think of the overall economic effects, one needs to think about what it's coming out of in addition to what it's going
Gentlelady's
to.
time has expired. Thank you. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I want to be able to continue on that same line of conversation about the long-term impact. Is there an economic benefit to balancing our budget? Not adding to additional, let's say, principal year after year. Is there a benefit to our economic development as a nation?
Well, I think, yes, Congressman, a smaller deficit, all the way down to zero, it can be better for the economy in the medium and long run than a large deficit. But what the economic effect is ultimately depends on how you do that.
How you get it, right? I understand that. Is the how you get there to the balance point also matters, and
yes.
That has to be done in a way that's judicious, and that makes sense for the economy itself. I interact with a lot of families that have a challenge of understanding this as they walk through the document, and they want to know how this applies to their individual family. So can you help bring that down to the individual family? What is the effect of a $16.5 trillion debt on a family, and what is the effect on how that grows? Let's say, as you mentioned, $7 trillion over the next 10 years. What effect does that have on an individual family? Now, I know you can't name the family and the address and say, this family will lose their job, this family will benefit. I get that. But the overall impact on a family.
Right. So I think, Congressman, over the next few years, with a weak economy, the government borrowing in order to keep taxes lower and spending higher helps the average family by producing more demand for goods in the economy and thus increasing the chance they'll be employed and get paid more. But as you go into the second half of the coming decade, when we think people will mostly be back at work, then the government's borrowing is competing with the borrowing that households want to do for their mortgage borrowing. It competes with the borrowing that the businesses they work for may be trying to do. And at that point, that competition for borrowing makes it harder for businesses to invest. That will tend to limit the extra equipment that workers have to work with, and because of that, it will tend to lower their wages and their family incomes relative to what would have happened if instead the government had not been borrowing so much in the credit markets.
Right, and that's not something you can just shut off and say, for the next 5 years, we're going to have the sugar high, and then once we get 5 years out, we're going to balance immediately, and then we'll correct that. That's something that has to be corrected when?
Well, so balancing immediately would have the consequences we've been discussing.
That'd be too rapid.
The exact timing is a matter of trade-offs, and we've written about this before. The sooner that the Congress acts, the lower the level of debt is likely to be 5 and 10 years from now. On the other hand, the sooner the Congress acts, the greater the contraction would be in the short term. And there isn't a single right answer.
This is, do you like it right now, or do you like it 5 years from now or 6 years from now?
Yes, that's right.
To be able to deal with the consequences and the issues. So you're saying that on current path, we can postpone the pain for 5 years, but it's coming.
I think it is coming, yes, Congressman.
Okay, let me ask you a question about the size of the interest. We talk a lot about the interest rates and such. Projected, when you talk about another $7 trillion being added to the debt, what are we talking about of the actual dollar size of an interest payment based on your projection? Right now we're paying around, give or take a few billion, around $300 billion a year in interest payments. What's your best guess on getting out to the end of the 10-year window what we're paying in interest in a single year?
So, Congressman, our projection for this year, fiscal year 2013, is the government would spend $224 billion on interest payments. We project that would grow to $857 billion in 2023. That's an increase as a share of GDP from about 1.4% to 3.3%, or almost 2 extra percent of GDP devoted to net interest payments.
So current path, that's with the SGR cuts, that's with everything else.
Yes.
Current path, by the end of the next decade, we're paying $857 billion just in interest.
Yes, just in that single year.
How many things do we have in our budget that are $857 billion?
Not very many, Congressman. It would be one of, there's a nice picture in our outlook. This would be one of the largest components of federal spending. Figure, for those who have the outlook in front of you, figure 1.3. You can see that by 2023, the major healthcare programs as a group and Social Security as a group would be more than net interest payments, but the net interest payments would be higher than defense spending. It would be higher than all non-defense discretionary spending. It would be higher than all mandatory spending, all the benefit programs apart from Social Security and the major healthcare programs.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Ryan and our ranking member, Van Hollen, for the warm welcome and look forward to serving on this committee. And thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. I think I have not heard from an economist or read the thinking of an economist who has not said that we have to approach this serious economic challenge by a balance of reducing spending and generating new revenues. And I think there's really no question that the President's articulation of that model is something that we have to do so that we both do it in a way that's properly timed, but also which is at the same time making the investments that are necessary to grow our economy. But clearly we have to reduce spending, and so we're going to have to make choices about what we invest in. And so I'm wondering if you would share some thoughts with us in terms of getting the most bang for our buck. What are the kinds of policies that when we are engaging in spending, we are likely to produce the greatest economic growth and the greatest help to our economy, because not all spending is the same. And so in that regard in particular, I'm interested to know your thoughts about infrastructure spending, really rebuilding the crumbling infrastructure of our country in sort of the old-fashioned WPA way, which leaves behind an asset which contributes to economic growth and our ability to move goods and services and information to compete in a global economy, and at the same time puts people to work immediately, but leaves behind a valuable asset. How does infrastructure in particular relate to economic growth and when we're making choices about how to do spending? And secondly, if you would speak to a proposal the President spoke about last night, which is a proposal to allow millions of American homeowners to refinance their homes at a lower interest rate, the market rates today, which I suspect, not being an economist, would produce, on average, I think they said $1,200 a year in new spending opportunities for families, provide substantial economic relief, help stabilize the housing market, but I also expect it would be a huge economic generator in terms of job creation. So if you could speak to those two issues.
Yes, Congressman. So when we talk about bang for the buck, sometimes we talk about that in a short-term context and sometimes in a medium or long-term context, and the answers can be different. In the short term, what matters most is how much of the extra dollar of government spending or how much of the lost dollar of taxes is spent and how quickly it's spent. Giving more money through spending increases or tax cuts to lower-income people tends to be more effective than doing the same for higher-income people because they tend to spend a larger share of the difference. In infrastructure spending, a lot of that gets spent, but depending on the project, it may get spent somewhat slowly. So in that sense, infrastructure can have a high bang for the buck ultimately, but it may not have as large a bang for the buck right now, because certain projects just take a while to get started on. In the medium term and long term, infrastructure investment, if devoted to high return projects, can in fact have a big effect on the state of the economy. About half of non-defense discretionary spending can be viewed as investment, either in physical structures or in people in the form of education and training. Not all that money is spent well, but some of it is clearly spent for things that the private sector would not otherwise provide. And some of those projects then can have high rates of return and can boost the economy in significant ways over time. I think the one concern that people have raised about the cutbacks in discretionary spending as a share of GDP that are in place under the sequester, but even under the original caps, people have expressed concern that that can end up limiting the investment the federal government does. Of course, it's hard to know for sure because you and your colleagues haven't made those specific choices yet. On changing, helping households to refinance in the way the President discussed last night, I don't know precisely what his proposal is. We'll see that when he releases his budget. But we have in the past done analysis of different ways of encouraging more refinancing. We think that can have a positive effect on the economy. In addition to helping those households, the overall effect depends crucially on how many households end up refinancing. So it depends crucially on how a program is designed, who is eligible, what the incentives are to households and to the lenders to do something differently than they're doing under current law. So the effects in aggregate can vary a lot across different ways of doing that. But dollar for dollar, it can be effective, as we reported in a report about a year or so ago.
When you say it depends on the amount, obviously the more Americans who are able to take advantage of it, if it's an easy program to administer, lots of eligible Americans, it will have a greater and more positive impact.
Yes, exactly, Congressman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for being here today. And I think I can thank you for this budget outlook, although it does, as you read through it, certainly bring up a lot of concerns about where we're going and the huge challenges that we'll expect going down the road. And as I was reading through here, I made some notes where I see a lot of things are unsustainable. Social Security is unsustainable, and without reform, it will go bankrupt in 2033. Medicare is unsustainable, hospital insurance trust funds end in 2023. Social Security disability insurance, which we don't talk very much about, and I think that is really an important topic that I'd love to see either this committee or some other committee take a look at, because I got concerned about this last year when I started reading about it will go bankrupt in 2016, a big concern. And then on the education side, Pell Grants, $1 billion shortfall in FY15, and then annual shortfalls of $5 billion or more from FY16 through 23. I mean, all of these programs, as we're looking at them, it's very, very scary to see that they're going to go bankrupt unless we have some form of reform. But let me now turn to look at the healthcare issue, because CBO cites that rising healthcare costs as a leading driver of our debts and our deficits. And the federal exchange subsidies alone are expected to cost $1.2 trillion, while the Medicaid expansions are expected to reach $638 billion. In knowing all of this, will this increase in spending, well, first of all, the Affordable Care Act, or the Obamacare, adds another $1 trillion in new health care entitlement spending. So here we go again, more health care entitlement spending. But will this increase in spending with the Medicaid expansions and the new exchange subsidies reduce health care cost growth as we look at the growth down the road?
Well, Congresswoman, the Affordable Care Act, as you know, had a number of different pieces with different sorts of effects. The expansion of insurance coverage, we now estimate will cost $1.3 trillion over the 2013 to 2023 period, those 11 years.
And Dr. Elmendorf, let me just interrupt you there to make sure that I understand. This is $1.3 trillion more than what was anticipated in previous outlooks of the program. Is that correct?
No, Congressman, I'm saying that the cost of the coverage expansion relative to a world that did not have that coverage expansion, there'll be extra costs to the federal budget of $1.3 trillion.
Extra costs.
We've made many changes to our projection of the cost of the Affordable Care Act coverage expansion, but they have netted out to actually very little change on balance for any given period of years. Our estimates through 2019 are now actually slightly below what they were when we first estimated the effects of that expansion in 3 years ago. As one moves the budget window further along, though, then of course one ends up with larger numbers for this expansion and for almost all existing federal programs and for tax revenue, because the economy is growing over time. So this particular part of the law raises federal costs in order to subsidize health insurance for people in particular ways. The law also included changes to Medicare that had the effect of bringing down the growth rate of Medicare spending over time. Taking those pieces together, we think the law has increased the federal government's budgetary commitment to health care in the long run, because ultimately those coverage expansions outweigh the Medicare savings. The law as a whole, in addition, included changes in tax provisions, and as a whole, we think it's a small deficit reducer. But the government's commitment to health care is increased because of the Affordable Care Act. How those Medicare changes will affect the growth of Medicare spending, we've made our best estimate of, but it's an uncertain business. And whether those changes in Medicare would spill over to the private sector, we don't know either. So we've not offered a view about whether and we don't do estimates of total national health expenditures. So we really tried to focus what we've done and what we've said to the federal budgetary effects.
And yet all of this, and I brought the chart up that you were actually referencing, this figure
exactly.
to show that the major health care programs are the greatest amount of money that is spent in any one particular category, and we're showing that it does grow.
Yes.
It doesn't come down, it doesn't curve down and
Yes.
level out, it continues to grow. And yet despite this, and this is the point I want to make at the end of the day, is yet despite this, we know that there are going to be people out there, more people that will be uninsured than previously expected, because there are a lot of dynamics that are also occurring here that are going to cause that reaction, that we'll have more people uninsured.
Time is
So
expired.
I just need to make, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but we project that the law will greatly reduce the number of uninsured Americans relative to what would be the case without that law in force.
Gentlelady's time has expired. With apologies to the gentlelady from Florida for not recognizing her in order, Ms. Castor is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for being here today and sharing your economic budget outlook. I think there are positive signs that should not be overlooked, that our economy is growing and we are adding jobs. That's consistent with what I see back home in Florida. There's greater construction work and more cranes popping up across town. Housing prices are up, so if you're a seller, I guess that's pretty good news. We've seen a significant drop in unemployment. The tourism industry has rebounded quite strongly after the BP disaster. And if you're fortunate enough to have money in the stock market, the past few years you've done very well. And last year I asked you if we had more people working across America, would our debt and deficit situation be largely improved? You said yes, and I assume you still believe this is the case,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
But it seems like we still have significant headwinds to getting past that 7.5% unemployment rate. And in your outlook, in your early testimony, you said you don't see great improvement there in the near term. So talk about the headwinds to greater employment across the economy, especially what is in the control of the Congress. What are the current policies that are in place that prevent us from lowering that unemployment rate?
So, Congresswoman, I think you described well a number of the factors that we see, underlying factors that are leading to economic growth. But as we've said, we think that the remaining parts of what had been the fiscal cliff of a few months ago, the remaining parts are still a substantial damper to economic growth this year. And one of the things that Congress might do to boost economic growth this year is to not let that fiscal tightening take effect. Of course, as you know, if you
sequester that.
So yeah, so there are a number of pieces of that, but one crucial piece is the sequester, and we think that if the Congress were to not have the sequester, then that would strengthen output this year and would lead to about 750,000 more jobs in the fourth quarter. At the same time, of course, as you know, that if there aren't offsetting changes made later, then that extra debt would become a drag on the economy in the medium term and long term.
Well, that's what I'm hearing from folks at home. Our major employers, for example, we have a large port. If we reduce infrastructure spending, they anticipate cutbacks, and private businesses especially. Our large research university, they rely a lot on innovation and science and medical research. They're also telling me, along with the Cancer Research Institute, very significant damage to what they're doing, but loss of jobs. Our large school district, the 9th largest school district in the country, and a large Air Force base at MacDill Air Force Base, civilian workforce projections. So colleagues, time is short. And I think what we're hearing today, if we want to address the debt and deficit, let's not do this to ourselves. Let's not self-inflict a wound that will set us back farther, put us back, dig us in deeper on long-term deficit and debt reduction. I think this is a warning sign, and Dr. Elmendorf is being very clear with us that we've got to work together and replace the sequester. That doesn't mean we're going to shirk our responsibility to address the long-term debt, the medium-term debt, but if we're going to be stuck with this 7.5% unemployment rate, that's not sustainable, to borrow a word that's been used this morning quite a lot. Dr. Elmendorf, are there other policies that could help us that are within the control of the Congress to create more jobs?
So, Congresswoman, you can think of them in a few categories. I think there are a number of changes in fiscal policy, higher spending or lower taxes than are under current law. And we've done, as you know, a few reports in the past few years of trying to evaluate the bang for the buck of different sorts of changes in tax and spending policy. Turning off the sequester would be one item on that list, but there are other items as well.
And then, did you also mention immigration in your outlook?
So we don't talk about it in the outlook. Of course, we've done other work on immigration. I think immigration can be a very positive force for the economy. More immigration could be a very positive force for the economy in the medium term and long term, depending on exactly what the reforms were that Congress might consider. Aren't likely to those reforms wouldn't take effect quickly enough to provide a big boost to the economy this year and next year. In terms of the short-term boosts, in addition to changes in fiscal policy, there are possible changes. I think just greater certainty about the course of fiscal policy would help, and maybe other changes that could be made as well.
Penalty's time has expired.
Thank you very
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for joining us again. Let's talk about a different subject for a minute. When you looked at the president's budget from last year, can you tell me when that budget balanced?
In our estimate of it, Congressman, it never reached a balanced budget.
Okay. And what would the economic, would you say that the spending and revenue profile in that budget was one that would help create a sustainable economy?
Well, Congressman, we did think the economy would be sustained, yes. I mean, we did an analysis of the economic effects of that budget. I don't remember the precise numbers. We still think the economy would be growing. But as I've said many occasions, a path that had less government debt would, by later in the decade and beyond, lead to a stronger economy, all else equal, and it depends what else.
Right. Well, even the OMB, by its own admission, said that debt beyond the 10-year window is going to reach unsustainable levels, and the economy would suffer as a result of that. What would the economic impact be if we were to raise taxes by $85 billion for the rest of this fiscal year starting on March the 1st, vis-a-vis having an $85 billion cut due to the sequester that also starts on March 1st?
Well, Congressman, that would depend on the nature of the tax increase.
Let's assume for a minute that's done through tax rate increases. What would the economic...
So I don't want to be difficult. It would still depend, as you know, on whose tax rates were cut. But in general, we think that...
Let's say we raised it on the top 1% again, that includes small business owners and...
So if the sequester were replaced by an equivalent dollar amount of increase in tax rates on high-income people, we would think that would be an improvement for the economy, because we think that the propensity to spend of those high-income people would be smaller, dollar for dollar, than would be the spending that would arise from the sequester.
So the lady on the corner that owns the dry cleaning store, when she has her taxes increase dramatically, is going to hire as many people and invest as much in the economy and continue with her expansion plans that she had prior to that tax increase.
Well, so I think, Congressman, that the lady on the corner would find that more people would come in with dry cleaning if they were the people who were working for the government or working on government contracts of the sort that would be increased by taking away the sequester. And I'm not trying to play a game here, but I think that is the effect we have in mind, which is that what businesses are most concerned about now is weak demand for their products.
So, I mean, under that line of thinking, what you do is you raise the taxes to 100% on high-income people and then spend all their money on government contracts.
So Congressman, you posed a
Don't
particular
answer the question.
experiment. We do try to be careful about extrapolating
It's more rhetorical than anything. How do you gauge the strength of this recovery over the last 4 years versus other economic recoveries post-World War II?
This has been a markedly weaker recovery.
Okay, how does it compare to the recovery that we had during the 1981 to 1988 timeframe? Or even you can go through 1993 if you'd like to.
So this is has been a much weaker recovery than we had in the early 1980s.
Okay. All right. The next thing, what was the 10-year cost of the Affordable Care Act when it was enacted? Do you remember that? Your cost estimates? Gross cost, not the deficit impact.
Yes, right. As you know, the deficit impact we thought was a slight deficit reduction.
Right.
The cost of the coverage expansion, maybe what you're referring to, over the 10-year window at the time, I don't know that number offhand. As I mentioned a little earlier, the number over that, the cost of the coverage expansion over that 10 years, we now think would be smaller by a little bit than we thought at the time. But as you know, the budget window, the 10 years that we now provide projections for, has moved out in time through 2023, and that increases the 10-year. The current 10-year cost defined in that way is higher.
Okay. And again, switching subjects for a minute, does the CBO look at unfunded obligations like what the actuarial obligations are of Social Security, of Medicare, Medicaid? Does CBO look at those?
Yes, Congressman. So in our long-term budget outlook, we include the cost of those programs, and we include comments on the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund.
But do you discount those back and say this is what the net unfunded obligation is for Social Security today?
Yes, we do, Congressman.
Okay. Do you have those numbers off the top of your head?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay.
But it is substantial, Congressman.
It's tens of trillions of dollars between Social Security and Medicare, correct?
I think that's right. We talk about this usually as a share of GDP because we think that's a useful way to measure the burden on the economy.
Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You were just asked whether this has been a more robust or weaker recovery than the ones, I guess, post-World War II, including the ones in the 1980s, and I think testified that this was a weaker recovery. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
But would it also be fair to say that in 2008, this country confronted the worst economic crisis and collapse that we've experienced in the history of the Republic, with the exception of the Great Depression?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
Okay. And the economy, since 2009, under this administration, is moving in the right direction based on any reasonable, objective economic measure. Wouldn't that be correct?
So the GDP has been growing since the summer of 2000, since the summer of that year. Yes, Congressman.
Well, let's take a look at some other numbers. So 6 million private sector jobs have been created over the last several years. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so, Congressman. Depends the point at which you start that tally.
Okay. And I believe about 500,000 manufacturing jobs have been created in America over the last few years. Is that right?
That may be. I don't know that offhand.
Okay. And I think unemployment, the unemployment rate is at or near its lowest level in the last 4 years. Is that right?
Yes, Congressman. I think that's right.
Okay. And home prices are rising at the fastest rate in the last 6 years. Is that correct?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. And I think home purchases are up approximately 50% at this point in time.
They're rising a good deal. I don't know the exact number.
Okay. And I think we've also reduced the deficit by about $2.5 trillion in the last several years. Is that correct?
So we've not tried to do a calculation like that. How much has been accomplished so far depends very much on the point in time at which one starts counting and the benchmark one is comparing to. So we have not done that calculation ourselves.
Okay. So it seems, though, based on any reasonable economic measure, the economy is clearly moving in the right direction. The question has been asked a few times today: is there any economic benefit to balancing the budget? I'd like to ask a different question. Is there any economic benefit to stimulating economic growth in the country at this moment in time?
Yes, Congressman, there is.
And what would be the best way, in your estimation, as you've examined this question, to stimulate economic growth?
Well, so the ultimate choices depend on people's judgments, your judgments, on behalf of your constituents as to what you think the government should and shouldn't be doing. But we have said that we think cuts in taxes or increases in spending that put money into people's hands where it is spent quickly can provide a crucial boost to the demand for goods and services and encourage businesses to hire workers, which then gives them income, which allows them to spend more, and so on.
And you've indicated that the best way, perhaps, to increase consumer demand is to make sure that we increase the amount of money that's placed into the hands of low-income or modest Americans. Is that right?
I think in terms of the bang for the buck, lower income Americans will tend to spend a larger share of extra money they get or reduction in taxes that they enjoy.
And do you think it would be reasonable to conclude that an increase in the minimum wage that was proposed recently by the president has been advocated by others, which would therefore place a greater degree of money in the hands of low-income or modest-income New Yorkers, would lead to an increase in consumer demand and therefore be good for the economy?
We have not studied a particular increase in the minimum wage carefully, Congressman. I think there are various effects at work. I think you're right, some people would get paid more, which they could then spend and would presumably spend. It's also true, though the evidence is mixed, we think there would probably be a small reduction in employment because the cost of workers would go up. We have not tried to work through those effects or others. It also, of course, depends on how much the minimum wage is increased and how that increase compares with what is the current minimum wage in many states. And in many states, of course, there's a different minimum wage, a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum.
Now, the greatest reduction in employment, at least that we could possibly face in the short term, would be to allow the sequestration to take place. Is that correct? We'd lose about 750,000 jobs in your estimation?
I think, again, the Congress could examine a range of fiscal policy options, but of the things that are about to happen under current law that you all talk about a lot, the sequester, taking away the sequester would have a noticeable effect in our judgment on output and jobs over the rest of this year.
Now, you mentioned that a loss of confidence in the government's ability to manage its affairs could trigger a sort of fiscal crisis where our ability to borrow at affordable rates is reduced. Is that right?
Yes.
And would it be reasonable that confronting a fiscal cliff in January, a potential debt ceiling default in March, sequestration, debt ceiling default in February, sequestration in March, government shutdown in April, another potential debt ceiling default in May, could perhaps shake the confidence of some investors in our ability to deal with our responsibilities?
Yes, Congressman, we think that the perennial crisis mode of fiscal policy over the past few years is reducing people's confidence. How big an effect that is, we don't know.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Okita.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Doctor, for being back with us. I think by anyone's objective measure in this town or country, we would consider you a smart man, an intelligent man, a good economist, right?
Thank you, Congressman.
That's why it befuddles me, although it's certainly the members' privilege and prerogative. It strikes me that some of us want to speechify rather than use this precious time to engage you in conversation through some questioning. And that's, for the record, I'd like to say I really appreciate Mr. Jeffrey's line of questioning. I'll try to continue on in that regard. Speaking of speechifying, we heard that it's impossible to get ourselves out of this debt situation through spending cuts alone. And I just want to understand if I am correct that the CBO projects that revenue will double from 2012, the 2012 level of $2.4 trillion to $5.0 trillion by 2023.
Yes, Congressman.
Okay, and that this year alone, revenues will grow by $259 billion from the previous year's fiscal level.
Yes, Congressman.
Yeah. According to your report, revenues have averaged just under 18% of the economy in recent history. Am I correct that you project under current law that revenues will rise to over 19%?
Yes, Congressman.
And isn't that above the historic average since World War II?
Yes, Congressman.
Am I correct that in a letter you wrote to Mr. Boehner last year, you estimated that the President's Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, will increase revenues, I say taxes, but increase revenues by $1 trillion?
Yes, Congressman, that's right.
Yeah. And that's because why?
That's because the law included a number of changes in tax rules that collect more money.
Taxes, in other words.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
I think most people were focused on the tax increases that hit higher income taxpayers. But am I correct that the payroll tax holiday expired as part of the fiscal cliff deal, or not being included in the fiscal cliff deal? Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, when you talked about in your opening remarks the public debt, I think, and correct me, interject if I have these numbers wrong. You said it was the public debt was 76% of our gross domestic product, the value of the goods and services this whole country, man, woman, and child, generates in a year.
Our projection for the end of this year, yes, Congressman.
76%.
Yes.
But going back to Mr. Flores' line of questioning, that's not the whole picture, right? I mean, because go through the definition of public debt and why I think it might be higher than that if you include what's missing from the Social Security Trust Fund, et cetera.
So in addition to the debt that's held by private citizens here and abroad and by the Federal Reserve System, there's also a substantial amount of government debt that is held by other government accounts,
Right.
the most prominent of which, the largest of which, is the Social Security Trust Fund. That debt is honest-to-goodness government debt, backed by the full faith and credit of the government. We don't include it in the debt measure that we focus on, nor do most analysts, because we and most analysts look at the government as a unified whole. And when we do projections of future spending, we take account of future Social Security and Medicare and other components of spending. So we capture the future obligations of those programs under current law in the way we do our projections of spending. So when we look at the debt, we look at the debt from the government owes to outside of the government.
So you don't calculate that debt until that debt becomes due. So when the Social Security Trust Fund has an IOU and gives it to the other hand of government to pay that IOU, that's when you count it at that time.
Yes, and as you know, so we actually produce projections of this larger, of gross debt. We report them in this outlook, but we don't focus on
If
them.
I wanted to include the Social Security Trust Fund in my remarks to constituents and trying to educate America as what's really happening here, what would be the debt to GDP ratio if you included the trust fund and any other significant debt?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I actually don't know that. I don't know that number.
Would you think it'd be over 100%?
That seems plausible, yes, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. And then with the remaining time I have, now remember, when I started my questioning, I complimented you about how smart you were, certainly relative to me. So take it in this vein. If I was taking your credit card application, your personal one, and under the question occupation, would it be plausible for you to tell me you were an economist?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. So you're familiar with the Austrian school, the Chicago school?
Yes, Congressman.
Keynesians, the neo-Keynesians, and all that.
Yes, Congressman. You and I have discussed this before, I think.
Which one? Okay. Which one do you prefer, and why are the other ones inferior? Which school?
25 seconds. So I think the consensus view in the economics profession is that what people think of as Keynesian economics, which is the output and employment depend on the demand for goods and services, answers important questions about what will happen in the economy when unemployment is very high, as has been over the past several years. But the consensus also thinks that over the medium term and long term, when unemployment is not generally so high, that what we think of as neoclassical economics is a better guide to what happens in the economy.
Yeah. And even Keynes thought that you got to stop the spending at some point.
Gentlemen's
I don't know.
time has expired.
35
Thank you very
seconds.
much. My time's expired, I'm told.
It
I'll
has
yield back.
indeed, yes. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Polkon.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. It's a pleasure to be on the committee, especially with so many people from Wisconsin. I know Mr. Ryan and I share a county. Back home we have neighboring districts, so it's great to be here representing my state. Dr. Elmendorf, you know, one of the top priorities as I look at it is growing the economy. How can we create more jobs right now to really get things going? That's the best way to get out of the deficit situation. And when, you know, especially before being here, watching the news, it seems like all they ever talk about is deficit reduction as the economic plan, as if Congress can't walk and chew gum. And I think we can do both. And part of that is how do we help grow the economy to help create those jobs. When I was on our Joint Committee on Finance back home in the legislature, I used to be the chair of the committee, and we had to approve every single recovery dollar, stimulus dollar that came through Wisconsin that came from Congress. And at that time, you know, anecdotally, I have a small business. I heard from small business owners who benefited from it. But more importantly, at that committee, we had the road building industry and the vertical construction industry. So, you know, road building and building buildings, not exactly your most liberal entities, put out a report saying that 54,000 jobs were saved or created just in the state of Wisconsin, thanks to those stimulus dollars and some other minor things we did in the legislature. And, you know, I look at that, and then I look at what the president said yesterday about kind of investing it back again. And then I saw a release from Speaker Boehner yesterday, and he said in his release, tonight he offered them little more than the same stimulus policies that have failed to fix our economy and put Americans back to work. And, you know, I know Wisconsin is a very unique place because those of us from there are very proud to be from there. I think we have good common sense, Midwestern values. But our experience was very different than that comment. I was just curious, I believe the CBO has done a report on the ARRA effects. Were there indeed, is it unique to Wisconsin, or were there total job increases across the country because of those investments?
So Congressman, we think that there were more jobs and more output produced because of the Recovery Act.
And what kind of number of jobs are we talking?
So it varies over time because the spending and the tax reductions from the Recovery Act varied over time. At the peak effect of the act in 2010 and 2011, we think there were between basically 500,000 and 3.5 million additional jobs.
Okay, so up to about 3.5 million. And then were there additional jobs since then through that peak period?
Yes, so there continues to be, in our estimate, slightly more employment than would otherwise be the case. But most of the money from that, both the spending side and the tax cuts, has now been spent. So the effects are dwindling.
So because of the job increase, I think it's fair to say, too, that it reduced the unemployment rate during that period?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. And then how about the effect on economic growth during that period? Did it have any net effect to the economy?
Yes, so we think it boosted economic growth in 2009 and 2010 by a considerable extent and brought down the unemployment rate, again, particularly in 2010 and 2011.
Okay. So, I just think as we look at what we're talking about, so often people talk about either you raise taxes or you cut spending as if those are the only two alternatives on the table. And I think maybe sometimes in Washington, those are the only two alternatives people seem to look at. But for those of us who come from the heartland or maybe are new around here, I've had a small business since I've had hair, and it was dark, all right? So I come from a little different perspective. But it does seem that there's another way, that if we can actually help to increase people getting to work and getting jobs, and if they're paying taxes, that trajectory we saw on spending is the problem on that chart, we could start to then close up that trajectory by bringing in real revenue without raising taxes on anyone, just by having more people becoming taxpayers. Is that a fair assessment?
So you're right, Congressman, that if more people worked and they earned more money, that could have a substantial positive effect on the budget. The question is what policies the Congress might enact and what the cost of those policies would be for the budget.
Gotcha. And then when people have talked about, too, when there's a dollar expended to do that, I mean, just like in business, if I invest in something, you've got a cost to do that, but I make a profit off of that ultimately. So there may be a 20, 40, 60, 80%, whatever the cost is depending on my product. Ultimately, you still can have a net gain, correct? So having that investment, if it's the right policy and it creates jobs, can help close that trajectory.
It's possible, Congressman, but if the government invests in something, even if that project earns a fairly high return for the economy as a whole, the government will collect only a small share of that higher return in future tax revenue. So finding projects that would pay for themselves by the federal government, I wouldn't want to rule out, but on the other hand, I think you should view that as a very high bar to reach.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to tell you how proud I am that we have a Georgian sitting as vice chairman of the committee this cycle. My freshman colleague from Wisconsin talks about common sense Midwestern values. It's those common sense Georgia values that give me great hope for this institution. So congratulations to you in that new role. Though I do want to talk about the common ground we have with Wisconsin. In fact, Rhode Island, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, was talking earlier about great public works programs. Before we start our questioning, Director, I just wanted to read from FDR's State of the Union speech back in 1935 when he said, "I am not willing that the vitality of our people be further sapped by the giving of cash or of market baskets. We must preserve not only the bodies of the unemployed from destitution, but also their self-respect, their self-reliance, their courage, and their determination." He called the payments going out at that time a narcotic, a subtle destroyer of the American spirit. And I would certainly hope as we talk about revenues and I think about refundable tax credits as being these cash payments, anything that we can do to work together to redirect those cash payments into those real jobs that provide real benefits to the human spirit, not just to the pocketbook, I look forward to working together on. But thinking about my common Georgia upbringings, Director, I wanted you to help me with some things. I heard a lot of discussion about we can't get to balanced budgets just by cutting spending, that there has to be a revenue component. My friend from Indiana pointed out that revenue is going to double over the next 10 years under your projection.
Yes, Congressman.
So our revenue component, if we do nothing more, we're going to double revenues to the federal government over the next 10 years?
Yes, Congressman, that's our projection.
Now, thinking about the cutting of the spending we're going to be doing over the next 10 years, if we do nothing over the next 10 years, how much will spending fall below current levels?
In dollar terms, Congressman, as you know, we expect the spending at the end of the decade will be quite a bit higher than spending is now.
Well, you say in dollar terms. What if we did it as a percent of the economy to adjust for inflation? Then how much lower would spending be in 10 years than it is today?
Well, so as a share of the economy, we project outlays in 2023 will be 22.9%, and last year they were 22.8%.
So over the next 10 years, they're not going down either?
There's a dip, and then there's an increase again.
Okay. So just to be clear, tax is going to double over the next 10 years in real dollar terms, spending not going to decline over the next 10 years, either in real dollar terms or in nominal dollar terms.
That's right,
According to your
Congressman. That's right. But as you know, as I mentioned earlier, there'll be roughly 40% more beneficiaries of the largest, most expensive federal programs a decade from now than there are today, and that's a critical factor driving those numbers.
Unquestionably, which leads me to believe that when you have serious people looking at these issues, as we do, that no one's actually talking about cutting spending. We're just arguing about how much more we're going to increase spending. Are we going to increase it a whole lot more? Are we going to increase it a little more because there are folks out there that we have to keep commitments to? As useful as I find the baseline, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the work that you do. I'm glad you do it instead of me doing it. I tell folks the best part of my job is really smart people are willing to invest time in me to make me smarter. But something I don't understand, you mentioned in your testimony that the alternative fiscal scenario assumes the sequester doesn't go into effect because you've had some members mention that. But does the baseline assume that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan comes to an end and that money ceases going out the door?
No. So what we do and have done
well,
for
let me
years,
ask, because it may be a follow-on to that. Does it assume that the Sandy supplemental spending was just a one-time effect and also won't go on going forward?
No, Congressman. So the answer to both parts of the question is that our projections of discretionary spending have never been about the cost of doing particular sorts of programs. They've always been extrapolations of the latest funding Congress has provided, with one crucial exception now of the caps on most discretionary spending. But the current funding for overseas wars, then the funding that the Congress has provided for related to Hurricane Sandy, we've extrapolated those with inflation, the way we have traditionally done discretionary spending as a whole.
And why is that? I mean, here we've done an alternative scenario because some members have suggested that something might happen, and yet we've baked into the baseline 10 years of Sandy aid, which we know with absolute certainty will never happen. What's the reason for that?
So, Congressman, I think for the things that as you know, our table of alternative policies includes numbers that allow you and your colleagues to subtract those particular provisions, if you would like, to construct your own projections of the budget balance. The reason we view those as somewhat different from the provisions in the alternative scenario is the alternative scenario has a set of permanent features of law that the Congress has in the past extended or deferred taking effect, whereas discretionary spending, as I said, has never been about particular programs. So we've written other reports, for example, on veterans health care, which is indiscretionary spending. We think that providing the level of care people now get to the people who are now eligible will be more expensive 10 years from now than is captured in the discretionary baseline.
Gentleman's time.
Hurricane Sandy may not recur, but other storms may come, other wars may come. So we try not to judge what the level of discretionary spending that you all would like to have in the future.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it is an honor to serve with you on this committee. Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for your testimony. It's been very useful. I have a pretty quick question here. We've spent most of our time today discussing the deficit, our debt, and the healthcare costs that are the big driver of future expenditures. But a couple of my colleagues have brought up Social Security. And so I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Elmendorf, if you could please explain the extent to which Social Security contributes to the deficit and the public debt that we saw illustrated on the chart. And also, if you assume that we should be focused like a laser beam on bringing the deficit down so that we can get our debt under control, would you agree that the discussion of reducing Social Security costs is a bit of a red herring?
So, Congressman, starting a few years ago and continuing indefinitely into the future under current law, the Social Security benefits that are being paid out exceed the Social Security tax revenues that are being collected. The Social Security Trust Fund also receives, as you know, interest payments on the debt that it holds. So at this point in time, Social Security benefits, as I said, are greater than the tax revenue, a little less than the tax revenue plus the interest payments. But on a unified budget basis, where the interest payments from one part of the government to the other wash out, Social Security taxes and benefits and taxes actually are increasing the budget deficit. And if you look in our projections out half a dozen years or so, by that point, the benefits will exceed the tax revenues plus the interest payments that will be paid in, so that the Social Security Trust Funds as a whole will be suffering annual deficits.
At what point, at what point does Social Security begin to contribute to the deficit?
Well, again, Congressman, on a unified budget basis, taking account of just the tax revenues, dedicated tax revenues, and the benefits, it is contributing to the deficit now. If one instead looks at just the balance in the Social Security Trust Fund, that balance is, the annual balance is positive now, but will be negative within about half a dozen years. I'm looking for the exact number and I can't find it. But it is changing quickly.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back his time.
I'm sorry, actually, Mr. Chairman, I do have the number to fully answer the question, which is that we think that by 2021, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund will have an annual deficit. The Disability Insurance Trust Fund is currently an annual deficit. Taking those pieces together, as people often do, we think the overall Social Security Trust Funds will be running annual deficits beginning in 2017.
Thank you. Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Renacci.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me.
Gentlelady from Wisconsin.
I do have time constraints, and I do believe that I've been overlooked.
The gentlelady is up following Mr. Renacci.
Oh, is he? How many Republicans did we take at one time?
We've gone back and forth, Republican, Democrat. Mr. Huffman just had the time.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
That's our gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Doctor, for being here. I just want to go back to my colleague's question on Social Security, because I did have a question on it, but the CBO baseline shows, and you previously mentioned that Social Security will run a cash deficit of $1.3 trillion over the next 10 years. Is that a true statement?
That may be, Congressman. I don't have that number in front of me, I'm afraid.
Okay. Going back to some of the discussions that have occurred, and it's been an interesting day for me. I've been a businessman most of my life, only been here a couple of years, so when I look at the business of the federal government as to how it's going and how my current businesses ran, my small businesses ran back home, I'd be scared to death of the trajectory of the direction we're going. And I think you said that continuing under the current policies, it's just not sustainable. Is that correct?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. One question earlier, somebody talked about jobs. Net jobs created over the last 4 years, is that a negative number or a positive number? Net jobs.
I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't have that, that number.
Let's go back to tax rates. And again, as a business owner, when my tax rates increased, I was concerned and would not employ more people. That was an easy answer for me. And if I didn't have any certainty and predictability of what those rates were going to be, I definitely didn't do much as far as the future. Do you have any correlation to the raising marginal rates and how it affects the economy? Because we've talked a little bit about that.
Yes, Congressman. So when we model the effects of big changes in fiscal policy, like the President's budget proposals each year, our models explicitly include the effects of changes in tax rates on people's work effort and on their saving behavior. We recently did a re-examination of the assumed amount of response that we have with a lot of consultation with outside experts, and made some adjustments in what we do and published reports describing how we read the evidence. But it's certainly the case in our view of the research literature that higher tax rates will tend to discourage work effort and saving.
So, as we talked about earlier, you heard that if we add taxes, if we do a balanced approach, when marginal tax rates go up, that's also going to slow the economy down.
That's right, Congressman. Again, all else equal, right? So the crucial question is what else is going on in the federal budget?
Do you think that comprehensive well, actually, let's go back to the fiscal cliff. When we passed the fiscal cliff here recently, do you think people moved their taxable income? Was there a shift in taxable income and a change in what they were going to do, knowing the rates were going up?
Yes, Congressman. We
So-
think that both corporations and individuals behaved differently at the last part of last year, not based on their expectations and their uncertainty about what was going to happen with the fiscal cliff.
So we'll see a jump up maybe in receipts this year because of that?
And in fact, federal receipts were strong in January, and that is, I think, part of the story. There's also, of course, the end of the temporary reduction in the payroll tax and other factors.
Let's talk a little bit about capital gains, which I know also changed. Capital gains rates could lead, in 2012, the JCT and the CBO said that higher tax rates on capital gains could lead to a level of inefficiency, and conversely, lower capital gain rates could in fact encourage investment. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, Congressman.
Do you believe an increase in the capital gains tax could increase the long-term productivity?
So you said they increase.
Knowing that we are increasing capital gains.
All else equal, Congressman, no. We don't think that an increase in the tax on capital is going to boost investment and thus output in the future. The question, as again, I have to emphasize, is all else is not usually equal. If that money is used to reduce borrowing, then that reduction in borrowing has a positive effect on the economy.
Right. I mean, my colleague earlier talked about revenues doubling over the next 10 years in your projection, and spending going up significantly. Do you have an idea how much spending is going to go up over the next 10 years?
I don't have that number calculated, Congressman. We think spending this year will be about $3.5 trillion, and in 2023 will be pushing $6 trillion. But I don't know the percentage change, I'm afraid.
Okay. I yield back at this time.
Gentleman yields back at this time. The gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for appearing today. I have seen how you have done this very delicate dance all morning as members have attempted to get you to agree with their approach about how to reduce the deficit, about how to grow the economy, what's more important, is this tax policy better or worse? So I do appreciate your indulgence and your patience in this. But what I guess I learned and heard from you today is that ultimately we make the decisions around here about what happens, and that, all things are not equal. So, for example, the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012, the so-called fiscal cliff thing we did New Year's Day, it doubled the deficit, didn't it? Went from like 2.3 trillion to 4.6 trillion. And and in that, I think we, for example, did not extend the payroll tax relief, and so therefore we didn't help poor people there. We did things like make the unemployment insurance until December 31st of this year, whereas we increased the estate tax relief, went back to former law, made that permanent so that couples up to $10 million have an exemption. So when we think about this provision, for example, in terms of long-term debt and the stimulative ability or lack thereof, do you have an assessment of this particular policy with respect to long-term deficit reduction?
So, Congresswoman, you actually understated the point. We thought deficits under current law would have been $2.3 trillion over the decade, and the New Year's law added about $4.7 trillion to deficits over the decade, so it essentially tripled the deficits under current law. That change greatly increased government borrowing. It also reduced tax rates. Those two changes have opposing effects on future output. We haven't actually done a specific estimate of the economic effects of that law. But as I've said before, the level of government borrowing has an important higher borrowing has a bigger negative effect on future economic outcomes, and that
Okay,
effect tends
Doctor,
to
I don't mean to
compound
be
over
rude,
time.
my time is waning,
Yes.
but I think that you have really made the point that there are consequences of policy, and here, this was an initiative that I think that helped wealthier people more, because the Bush era, Obama era, whatever you want to call it, tax rates disproportionately helped richer people. Same thing with tax expenditures. We heard discussion here earlier about, and Greenspan calls them not tax expenditures, but tax entitlements. Isn't it in fact true that the tax expenditures almost equal the Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security all together, that they almost equal that amount, and that they disproportionately go to wealthier people? I mean, 60% of our tax entitlements go to, maybe 20% of the wealthiest people.
So, Congresswoman, in our report last year, we showed that tax expenditures through the individual income tax and the payroll tax were larger than government spending on Social Security, larger than spending on defense, larger than spending on Medicare. The distribution varies a good deal across tax expenditures. Some of them benefit higher income people disproportionately. Others are more focused on lower income people. We have some work underway on
Well,
the
there's a lot of
distribution
complaint,
tax
Dr.
expenditures.
Elmendorf, about the 50% of people who don't pay any income tax. And so, I mean, the tax expenditure program for homeowners and for charitable donations, which are good tax expenditures, there's a lot of waste in it as well. I just want you to stipulate in your testimony here that, in fact, there is a lot of spending that is done through tax expenditure programs, and it increases the income disparity.
So I think, Congresswoman, that many
It's
economists...
very regressive.
I think many economists agree that tax expenditures are best thought of as government spending, even though they appear in the budget as
And they're
reduction in
regressive.
revenues.
Are they regressive?
We have work underway on the distribution of tax expenditures, and it's not finished yet, and I don't want to speak ahead of our having completed that analysis.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you for indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Messer, 5 minutes.
I had another question.
Questioner today.
I think that's accurate, and we'll appreciate you turning on your mic.
Yeah, I just say, that we've already eaten up my time without the mic, right? So thank you, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Doctor. Just made the point, I'm the final questioner today. Appreciate that. Somebody gets to do it, and today it's me. Doctor, I want to thank you for your eloquence, thank you for your knowledge and wisdom, and thank you for your stamina. Today's committee hearing.
And yours, Congressman, you may be one of the few people who's actually sat through an entire hearing.
Yeah, well, when
in
you,
my
when you're new
experience.
here,
Oh, and you too, Congressman.
yeah, but when you're new here, you want to learn, and so I appreciate the knowledge I've been able to gather today. I wanted to focus just for a second on a comment that you made earlier, and want to make sure that I have it accurate. You mentioned that by, was it 2023, we would have 40% more recipients of Medicare and Social Security than today?
Roughly, yes, Congressman.
And, there's a lot of rhetorical energy spent around this building, appropriately so, making the point that we want to make sure we keep our commitments to those who've invested through a lifetime in Social Security and Medicare. It's certainly a commitment I intend to keep. I know of no one on either side of the aisle who believes any differently. If you saw that number and saw that we were going to increase by 40% by 2023, but you also knew that we were going to increase our workforce by 40% by 2023, so that you had the same number of taxpayers footing the bill for those benefits or at least per recipient, then you wouldn't be nearly as alarmed by that number as you might be in a scenario that's far different. And so
yes.
I was hoping you could comment just a minute about maybe the historical trend of how many taxpayers we've had per recipient in those programs and where we're going in that same trend.
Yes, Congressman. So we project that the labor force will grow much more slowly in the coming decade than it has grown over the past several decades. And there are two main reasons for that. One is the retirement of the baby boom generation. As they came into the labor force, they boosted labor force growth, and as they retire, they will be holding it down. And the second is an end to the longstanding increase in women's labor force participation, which again pushed up the participation rate late in the last century, but has been pushing the other direction, but has not been doing that now. So we think that labor force growth will be a good deal slower going forward than it's been in the past. A lot of that is outside of the control of the Congress, but there are policies that Congress can enact or not that can have effects on labor force participation. And it's policies on both the tax and spending sides of the budget.
Yeah, and I know you're probably reluctant to just throw out numbers that you may have not have access to right in front of you, but could you talk just a little bit at least, if you have specific numbers, great, but in the last 10 to 20 to 30 years, how many workers per recipient did we have? What are the likely trends by 2023, for example?
So I know that I have one fact, which is that a few years ago, 21%, a few years ago, the population aged 65 or older was 21% of the population between ages 20 and 64. So 65 or older relative to those of working age, 20 to 64. That share was 21% a few years ago, and it will be 37% 25 years from now.
Which would lead you to understand there'll be fewer people paying for each recipient later.
Yes.
If you can get those numbers to me, I would appreciate it. Like to see
Yes,
something,
Congressman.
whatever we're able to get track of.
Yes.
Just would want to make this very simple point, rightly so. A lot of energy is spent talking about the injustice that would fall to those who've invested and paid in over their lifetimes if they did not receive the benefits that they rightly should receive. But probably not enough energy is spent talking about the injustice to the next generation, those who will pay far more into a program through which they may receive far less if nothing is done either. And so as we focus as a body on the importance of the justice of making sure that current recipients and those nearing retirement receive those benefits, I hope we spend equal energy thinking about the next generation and how we preserve these programs for them.
I would just say, Congressman, we produce a report every summer or fall on the Social Security program, which lays out just the points you're making about the ratio of workers to beneficiaries and about the effects of the differential effects of the program on people born in different birth cohorts and at different points in the income distribution.
I'd love to see that.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank Director Elmendorf for being with us today, for his wisdom and his patience. I am charged with asking unanimous consent that members have 7 calendar days to submit questions for the record, and without objection so ordered, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Congressman.